Tonight, we settle in for a journey through the highlands of Scotland, a land of green hills and ancient stones. This is the story of William Wallace, a man who became a symbol of freedom. We'll move through his life gently, watching as a simple farmer transforms into a legend. But before we drift into tonight's sleep story, my name's Murphy. If these stories help you relax, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always beautiful to see people winding down together across the world under the same night sky. Now let's dim the lights and let the story roll. Our story opens in the year 1280, in the rugged countryside of Scotland. The land is beautiful, but harsh, with rolling hills covered in heather and small villages scattered across the valleys. Stone cottages with thatched roofs sit clustered together, and smoke rises gently from their chimneys into the grey sky. Scotland at this time is not a free nation. The English king, Edward the Longshanks, has placed his control over the Scottish people. English soldiers patrol the roads, and English nobles collect taxes from farmers who can barely feed their own families. The Scottish people work the land their ancestors worked for generations, but they no longer govern themselves. In these villages, life moves slowly. Men tend sheep on the hillsides, women weave cloth by firelight, and children play among the stones. But underneath the daily routines, there's a quiet tension. The people remember when Scotland was ruled by its own kings, and they whisper about freedom when the English soldiers aren't listening. The landscape itself seems to hold memories. Ancient standing stones mark places where clans once gathered. Lochs reflect the changing sky, sometimes blue, sometimes grey. The wind carries the scent of rain and earth, and in the distance, mountains rise like sleeping giants. In one of these small villages, a boy named William Wallace grows up. He's perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with curious eyes and a quick mind. His father, Malcolm Wallace, is a simple farmer and a good man who believes in doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Malcolm is not a soldier by nature, but he understands that sometimes a man must stand up for his family and his land. He's tall and weathered, with hands roughened by farm work. When he speaks, people listen, because his words are thoughtful and true. Young William has an older brother named John. The two boys are close, spending their days helping with chores and exploring the hills around their home. They're learning what it means to be Scottish in a time when being Scottish means living under someone else's rules. One quiet evening, Malcolm gathers his sons and explains something important. He tells them that it's not enough to simply fight when you're angry. A man must also use his mind, must think before he acts. He explains that the heart gives you courage, but the brain keeps you alive to fight another day. William listens carefully to his father's words. Even as a young boy, he's beginning to understand that the world is more complicated than he once thought. Freedom isn't just something you're given. It's something you must be willing to sacrifice for. Not long after these quiet conversations, something terrible happens that changes everything. Word spreads through the village that the English have called a meeting with Scottish nobles. It's meant to be a discussion about governance, about finding peace between the two nations. Malcolm decides to attend, along with several other men from the village. They dress in their simplest clothes and make the journey to a nearby farm where the meeting is to take place. The morning is cool and damp, with mist hanging low over the fields. When they arrive, they find a large barn. Other Scottish men are already there, farmers and small landholders who care about their country's future. They speak in low voices, uncertain about what this meeting will bring, but hopeful that perhaps some understanding can be reached. But this is not a meeting. It's a trap. English soldiers surround the barn, and the Scottish men realize too late that they've been deceived. Inside the barn, nooses have been prepared. The English have no intention of negotiating. They plan to make an example of anyone who might dare to resist English rule. Young William and John, who have followed their father at a distance out of curiosity, hide nearby. From their hiding place behind some bushes, they watch in silent horror as the Scottish men are hanged, one after another. The bodies sway gently in the breeze, and the world seems to go very quiet. William wants to look away, but cannot. His father is among those men. Malcolm Wallace dies not in battle, but in an act of cold cruelty meant to frighten others into submission. Before the hanging, there had been talk among the Scottish men about fighting back. Malcolm Wallace had been part of these discussions, meeting with neighbours who were growing tired of English taxation and control. When tensions rose, Malcolm and John prepared to join other Scots in a small uprising. It wasn't a grand battle, just local men trying to protect their own land and families. They gathered whatever weapons they could find: farming tools, old swords, simple spears. Malcolm spoke to young William before leaving, telling him to stay home and look after things while they were gone. He touched William's shoulder with rough but gentle hands, and for a moment, father and son simply looked at each other, sharing an understanding that didn't need words. John, excited and nervous, checked his equipment several times. He was old enough to fight, but still young enough to feel uncertain. He tried to appear brave for his younger brother, standing a little straighter, speaking with more confidence than he probably felt. The men left the village in the early morning, moving quietly through the mist. They knew they were outmatched by English forces, but they also knew that doing nothing meant accepting defeat without even trying. The uprising was brief and unsuccessful. English soldiers, better trained and better equipped, quickly put down the resistance. Malcolm and John Wallace, along with many others, never returned home. When news reached the village, it came through whispered conversations and sorrowful faces. Women who had been waiting by their windows slowly understood that their men would not be coming back. Children asked questions that their mothers struggled to answer. Young William learned that both his father and brother had died. The details didn't matter as much as the simple, crushing fact that his family was suddenly much smaller. The cottage that had been filled with his father's voice and his brother's laughter now felt empty and too quiet. Malcolm's body was returned to the village for burial. The funeral was a simple affair, as most things were in that time and place. Neighbors gathered, said prayers, and helped dig the grave on a hillside where wildflowers grew in the spring. William stood at the graveside, his face expressionless. He was too young to fully process the weight of his loss, but old enough to understand that his life had permanently changed. The world suddenly seemed colder and less safe. The graves were marked with simple stones. The wind blew across the hilltop, bending the grass in waves, and William stood there long after the others had gone home, just a small figure against the big sky, trying to understand what it meant to be alone. At the funeral, a man appeared whom William had seen only a few times before. This was Argyle, Malcolm's brother. He was different from Malcolm in many ways, more worldly, more travelled and less tied to the land. Argyll had been away for years, living in different parts of Scotland and even beyond. He was educated, which was unusual for a common Scotsman. He knew languages and had read books. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from having seen more of the world than most villagers could imagine. After the burial, Argyll approached William. He knelt down to the boy's level and spoke softly. He explained that William couldn't stay in the village alone, that a young boy needed guidance and protection. He said that William would come live with him for a while. William didn't argue or protest. He was still numb from loss, moving through the world as if in a dream. He gathered his few possessions, some clothes, a small knife his father had given him, a wooden horse his brother had carved. Before leaving, a young girl approached William. Her name was Murren, and she was about his age. She lived in the village with her family, and she and William had played together as children do. She didn't say anything, but she handed him a flower, a purple thistle, the symbol of Scotland. Her eyes were sad and kind. William took the flower and nodded his thanks. Then he climbed onto a horse behind his uncle, and together they rode away from the only home William had ever known. He turned back once to see the village growing smaller behind them, the stone cottages and smoking chimneys fading into the mist. Argyll's home was in a different part of Scotland, more remote and wild. It was a simple stone house, but inside were things William had never seen before: books, maps, strange instruments. The walls held weapons from different lands, and the shelves contained objects that Argyll had collected in his travels. Life with Argyll was different from anything William had known. Each day followed a pattern of learning. Argyll believed that a man needed 3 things to survive in a difficult world: the ability to think, the ability to fight, and the ability to understand other people and cultures. In the mornings, they studied. Argyll taught William to read, starting with simple words and gradually moving to more complex texts. William learned Latin, the language of scholars and the church. He studied history, learning about the great leaders and battles of the past. Argyll showed him maps and explained how the world was much larger than Scotland, filled with different peoples and different ways of living. William discovered that he enjoyed learning. Words opened doors to ideas he'd never considered. Stories from ancient Rome and Greece showed him that people had been fighting for freedom and justice for thousands of years. He began to understand what his father had meant about using his mind as well as his heart. In the afternoons, they trained in combat. Argyll taught William how to use a sword, how to move his body efficiently, how to read an opponent's intentions. They practiced with staffs and with their hands. William learned that fighting wasn't just about strength. It was about timing, balance, and staying calm when danger threatened. Argyll pushed William hard, but never cruelly. When William fell, Argyll helped him up and explained what he'd done wrong. When William succeeded, Argyll nodded his approval, but reminded him that there was always more to learn. In the evenings they talked. Argyll told stories about the places he'd been and the people he'd met. He explained that England wasn't inherently evil, but that King Edward's ambition and cruelty had created suffering. He taught William that revenge alone wasn't enough, that lasting change required vision and planning. The years passed this way, seasons turning one into another. William grew taller and stronger. His hands became skilled with weapons. His mind became sharp with knowledge. But most importantly, he developed a sense of purpose. He understood, gradually and deeply, that his life would not be simple or peaceful, but that it could have meaning. Many years passed before William saw his childhood village again. By the time he returned, he was a grown man, perhaps in his late 20s. He was tall and strong, with long hair and a thick beard that made him look older than his years. His eyes held both the gentleness his father had possessed and a new intensity born from loss and learning. William travelled on horseback, moving slowly through the familiar landscape. The hills hadn't changed. The same stone walls divided fields, the same streams ran down from the mountains. But William himself was completely transformed from the boy who had left. He wore simple clothes, the rough wool and leather of a common farmer. He carried his possessions in a small pack and had weapons wrapped in cloth. As he rode, he took in everything around him with careful attention, noting details that most people would miss. The village appeared much as he remembered it, though perhaps a bit more worn. The same cottages stood in roughly the same places. Smoke rose from chimneys. Dogs barked at his approach, and chickens scattered across the dirt path. People looked at him curiously as he passed. Some didn't recognize him at all. Others squinted, trying to match this strong, weathered man with the boy they'd known years ago. A few older villagers began to realize who he was, and whispers spread from house to house. William rode to what had been his family's land. The cottage was still standing, though it looked abandoned. The garden his mother had tended was overgrown. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. He dismounted and stood there for a long moment, just looking, remembering. He wasn't coming home to farm, though that's what he told himself and others. He was coming home because something inside him needed to reconnect with his roots, to touch the soil where his father and brother were buried, to walk the paths he'd walked as a child. The afternoon light was soft and golden, casting long shadows across the land. Birds called to each other in the trees, and William Wallace, educated and trained, and filled with quiet determination, stood on his family's land and wondered what would come next. As word spread that Malcolm Wallace's younger son had returned, people began to approach him. Some remembered him well, while others had only heard stories. They welcomed him back with a mixture of warmth and curiosity. An older man named Hamish came to see him. Hamish had been a friend of William's father, and he'd watched William grow up before the boy left with his uncle. Now Hamish was middle-aged, thick-bodied, and strong, with a rough sense of humor and a loyal heart. He clasped William's arm in greeting and said it was good to have a Wallace back in the village. Hamish introduced William to his own son, also named Hamish, who was around William's age. The younger Hamish was skeptical at first, wanting to test this newcomer who claimed to be one of them. But William met his challenges with good humor, and soon enough they found themselves laughing together. Others came by as well, families who had known the Wallaces, people who had suffered their own losses to English rule. They shared meals and stories. They asked William where he'd been and what he'd learned. He answered their questions honestly, but simply, not wanting to seem different or better than them. The village had changed in some ways. There were new faces, children born after William left, young people who had grown up in his absence. There were also absences, people who had died or moved away, families torn apart by English taxation and arbitrary cruelty. But the basic rhythms of life continued much as they always had. People still worked their fields, tended their animals, and gathered in the evenings to share warmth and conversation. They still spoke Gaelic among themselves, keeping their language alive, even as English was forced upon them in official matters. William fell back into these rhythms easily. He helped with repairs around his old home, making it livable again. He worked alongside his neighbors in their fields, sharing labor as was customary. His hands remembered the feel of farm tools, even though they were now equally comfortable with swords. He attended gatherings at the village tavern, where men drank ale and talked about crops and weather and the occasional piece of news from beyond their valley. He listened more than he spoke, learning what life had been like in his absence, understanding the small daily indignities his people suffered under English rule. One morning, William was working on repairs to his cottage roof when he noticed someone watching him from a distance. It was a young woman, standing near a garden with a basket on her arm. She had dark hair and a gentle face, and she was looking at him with an expression of recognition and uncertainty. For a moment, neither moved. Then William climbed down from the roof and walked toward her, slowly. As he got closer, memory stirred in him. This was Murren, the girl who had given him a thistle flower on the day he left the village. She had grown into a beautiful woman, but her eyes held the same kindness they'd had when she was a child. She smiled slightly, still uncertain about approaching him after so many years. William stopped a respectful distance away and greeted her quietly. He asked if she remembered him, and she nodded, saying she'd known who he was the moment she saw him ride into the village. She'd been waiting to see if he would remember her. They talked for a while, standing there in the morning sunlight. She told him about her life. She still lived with her family, helped with household work, and tended a small garden. He told her a little about his years away, though not everything. Some things were too complex or too painful to explain in a simple conversation. There was something easy about talking to Murren. William found himself relaxing in her presence, smiling more genuinely than he had in a long time. She had a quiet wisdom about her, a way of listening that made him feel understood without having to explain everything. As they spoke, other villagers passed by, noting the conversation with interest. In small villages, everyone notices when two people spend time together, especially two people of marriageable age. But William and Murren seemed unaware of the attention, focused only on each other. When Murren said she needed to go, that her mother would be expecting her, William found himself reluctant to end the conversation. He asked if he might see her again, perhaps walk with her sometime. She agreed, her smile growing warmer, and then she turned and walked away, her basket swinging gently at her side. William watched her go, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the fire of anger or the cold determination of purpose. It was something warmer and more hopeful. The possibility that life could hold more than just struggle and loss. In the days and weeks that followed, William and Murren began spending more time together. Their courtship was gentle and gradual, following the quiet patterns of village life. They would meet in the early mornings, when mist still hung over the fields. Sometimes William would help her carry water from the well, walking beside her, and talking about small things, the weather, the harvest, childhood memories. Other times they would simply pass each other in the village and exchange glances that said more than words could. On market days, when the village became busier with people trading goods and sharing news, William would somehow end up near wherever Murren was. He'd offer to carry her purchases or walk her home. She'd accept with a smile that made the simple act feel significant. They took walks together in the countryside, following paths through the heather. William showed her places he'd explored as a child, a particular rock formation, a hidden stream, a hilltop with a view across the whole valley. Murren shared her own special places, spots where wildflowers grew thickest, or where you could sit and watch birds nesting. During these walks, they talked about everything and nothing. Murren asked about the years he'd spent away, and William told her what he could, describing his uncle's teaching and the strange, wonderful things he'd learned. He was careful not to make her feel that he'd outgrown the village or thought himself above his origins. Murren spoke about her dreams, simple ones befitting their time and place. She wanted a family, a home where children could grow up safely, seasons passing peacefully one into another. She wanted what her parents had, a partnership built on respect and affection, quiet happiness in a world that often seemed harsh. William found himself drawn to this vision, to the possibility of a normal life. Part of him had always assumed his path would be one of conflict and struggle, that his father's death had set him on a course that couldn't be changed. But with Murren, he glimpsed another possibility. Perhaps he could honor his father's memory simply by living well, by being happy. They began to hold hands while walking, a simple intimacy that felt profound. William would help her over rough ground, and she would steady him when the path was steep. They fit together naturally, two people who understood each other without needing to explain everything. The village noticed, of course. Older women smiled knowingly when they saw the couple together. Men teased William good-naturedly, making jokes about him being tamed by a woman's gentle hand. William accepted the teasing with grace, not denying his feelings or hiding them from anyone. Murren's father, a stern but fair man, watched William carefully. He saw a young man who worked hard, who treated his daughter with respect, and who had already known loss and hardship. Eventually he gave a slight nod of approval, indicating that William would be welcome as a son-in-law if things continued in that direction. As summer turned toward autumn, William and Murren's connection deepened into something permanent and true. They spoke seriously about a future together, about building a life in the village where they'd both grown up. The plans were simple and practical: repairing the Wallace cottage, preparing fields for spring planting, gathering what they'd need for a household. But there was joy in these simple plans. When William imagined the future now, he didn't see only struggle and loss. He saw Murren beside him, children playing in the yard, peaceful years stretching ahead. It was a beautiful dream, one that made all his study and training seem less important than this one simple thing: being with someone who made life worth living. However, the world they lived in would not leave them in peace. English rule over Scotland had grown even more oppressive in William's absence. King Edward had implemented new laws designed to break the spirit of the Scottish people and prevent any future uprisings. One of these laws was called prima nocta, an ancient and cruel practice. It stated that English nobles and their appointed officials had the right to spend the first night with any Scottish bride on her wedding night. This law was designed not just to humiliate Scottish men, but to ensure that Scottish bloodlines would be mixed with English ones, gradually erasing Scottish identity. In the village, English soldiers had taken up residence in a small garrison. They were led by a local magistrate, an Englishman who enforced the king's laws with cold efficiency. The soldiers themselves were a mixture of types, some simply doing their duty, others taking pleasure in the power they held over the Scottish villagers. These soldiers made their presence felt constantly. They patrolled the village, collected taxes, and demanded respect from people who had no choice but to give it. They drank at the tavern without paying, took food from market stalls without offering coin, and treated Scottish women with inappropriate attention that couldn't be openly challenged. The law of prima nocta was enforced strictly. When Scottish couples wanted to marry, they had to request permission from the magistrate. On the wedding night, the English official would exercise his supposed right, and the new husband would have to wait outside his own home, humiliated and helpless. Some couples tried to refuse, but refusal meant severe punishment, imprisonment, public beatings, or worse. Other couples simply lived together without marrying, but this too was risky. The church frowned upon it, and children born outside marriage faced their own difficulties. The villagers lived with this injustice daily, their anger growing but finding no outlet. Men would sit in the tavern and speak in low, furious voices about the indignity of it all. Women would cry in private, feeling violated and powerless. Young people wondered if they'd ever be able to marry with dignity and start families without this shadow hanging over them. William heard about all of this shortly after returning to the village. At first, he could hardly believe such a law existed. It seemed too cruel, too designed to cause suffering. But when he saw the bitter expressions on men's faces and the fear in women's eyes when the subject came up, he understood that it was real, and it was enforced. He thought about Murron, about their growing love, and the future they'd begun planning. The idea that some English soldier or nobleman might claim the right to spend their wedding night with her filled him with a cold, deadly rage. But he kept this rage hidden, locked away behind a calm expression, waiting to see what could be done. William and Murron knew that they wanted to be together, but they also knew that a public wedding would mean facing the humiliation of prima nocta. They talked about this problem late into the evening, sitting together outside her family's cottage, speaking in whispers so no one would overhear. Murron suggested that perhaps they could marry in secret. There were ways to do this, quiet ceremonies performed by sympathetic priests who opposed the English laws but couldn't do so openly. If they married this way, without public announcement or official registration, perhaps they could avoid the magistrate's notice. William was hesitant at first. He wanted to marry Murron properly, to celebrate their union with the whole village, to do things honorably and in the open. But he also understood the reality of their situation. If they went through official channels, Murron would suffer, and he wouldn't be able to protect her. They decided that a secret marriage was their only real choice. William spoke quietly to the village priest, an old man who had known William's family and who had grown to hate the English laws that violated everything he believed about the sanctity of marriage. The priest agreed to help, though he warned them of the risks. The ceremony was arranged for a quiet evening in a small clearing in the forest outside the village. Only a few people attended, Hamish and his father, who William trusted completely, and Murron's mother, who wept quietly throughout the ceremony. The evening was beautiful, with soft light filtering through the trees and birds singing their last songs before nightfall. Murron wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, with flowers woven into her hair. William wore his best clothes, which weren't much, but he stood tall and proud, looking at his bride with open love. The priest spoke the words of the ceremony quickly and quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. William and Murron held hands, repeating their vows in the ancient way, pledging themselves to each other for as long as they both should live. They exchanged a piece of cloth, a traditional Scottish symbol of their binding together. When the priest, pronounced them married, William pulled Murren close and kissed her gently. The few witnesses smiled, and for a moment everything felt perfect and right. Two people who loved each other had made a commitment, and not even English law could truly diminish that. They walked back to the village separately, pretending they'd been in different places. Murren returned to her family's home, and William went to his own cottage. But something fundamental had changed. They were husband and wife now, bound together in the eyes of God and the few people who mattered most to them. In the following days, they continued to be careful. They couldn't live together openly or acknowledge their marriage publicly, but they found ways to be together, meeting in private, sharing moments away from curious eyes. They began preparing William's cottage quietly, bringing in supplies and making improvements that wouldn't attract too much attention. It wasn't the life they'd dreamed of, but it was theirs, and they were together. That had to be enough for now. They both hoped that someday, perhaps, Scotland would be free and they could live openly as husband and wife. But for now, secrecy was the price of their happiness. Life under English occupation had always been difficult, but as time went on, the soldiers seemed to grow bolder and more cruel. Perhaps they were bored, stationed in a quiet village with little to do. Perhaps they'd simply stopped seeing the Scottish villagers as fully human, as people deserving of basic respect. One afternoon, several English soldiers came through the market square. They were young men, well armed and wearing the colours of King Edward. They moved through the stalls with arrogant confidence, taking apples from one vendor, bread from another, never offering payment. When a Scottish man tried to protest, one of the soldiers shoved him roughly, knocking him into the dirt. The other villagers tensed, wanting to help, but knowing that any resistance would bring harsh punishment. The soldiers laughed, enjoying the fear and helplessness they created. The soldiers began making comments about the Scottish women, crude remarks delivered loudly enough for everyone to hear. When a young woman walked past carrying a basket, one soldier deliberately stepped into her path, making her drop what she was carrying. Another soldier suggested she pick it up slowly, making lewd gestures that caused his companions to laugh. William was present in the market that day, standing near the edge of the square. He watched all of this with carefully controlled expression, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to act, to defend these people who were his neighbors and friends. But he also knew that acting rashly would only make things worse, that one man couldn't fight an entire garrison. Hamish stood nearby, also watching. He glanced at William, and the two men exchanged a look that needed no words. They were both thinking the same thing, that this couldn't continue forever, that eventually something would break. After the soldiers finally left, laughing among themselves and carrying their stolen goods, the villagers slowly returned to their activities. But the mood was dark. People spoke in angry mutters, their faces showing frustration and shame. They were tired of being treated this way, tired of having no recourse, no way to defend themselves or their families. That evening, men gathered at the tavern and spoke in low, bitter voices. Some talked about fighting back, about organizing resistance. Others argued that such action would be suicide, that the English army would crush them without hesitation. A few wondered if anyone would ever stand up to this tyranny, or if they were doomed to live under English boots forever. William listened, but said little. He was thinking, calculating, remembering everything his uncle had taught him about strategy and timing. He wasn't ready to act yet, wasn't ready to become a leader or a fighter, but seeds were being planted in his mind. Ideas about what might be possible if someone was brave enough or foolish enough to take the first step. One morning, not long after, Murren went to the village well to draw water. It was early, with mist still hanging in the air and few people about. She carried 2 wooden buckets and moved quietly, thinking about William and the secret life they were building together. As she bent to fill her buckets, she heard boots on the cobblestones behind her. She turned to find 3 English soldiers approaching, the same men who had caused trouble in the market days before. They were smiling in a way that made her stomach tighten with fear. One of them made a comment about how pretty she was, asking why he'd never noticed her before. Another stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch her hair. Murren stepped back, telling them firmly to leave her alone. But they didn't leave. They surrounded her, cutting off her escape routes. One grabbed her arm, and when she tried to pull away, he tightened his grip. They were playing with her, enjoying her fear, seeing how far they could push before she truly panicked. Murren had always been gentle, but she wasn't weak. Years of farm work had made her strong, and fear gave her additional strength. When the soldier wouldn't release her arm, she swung one of her buckets hard, hitting him in the face with a satisfying crack. The soldier staggered back, blood running from his nose. His companion stopped smiling. The mood changed instantly from cruel playfulness to genuine anger. They grabbed Murren roughly, and when she tried to fight them off, one struck her hard across the face. The commotion attracted attention. Villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by the sounds of struggle and Murren's cries. William was among them, running from his cottage at the sound of her voice, his heart pounding with sudden dread. He reached the well to find soldiers holding Murren, her face already beginning to bruise. She looked at him with terror in her eyes, and William started forward without thinking, ready to tear the soldiers apart with his bare hands. But Hamish caught his arm, holding him back. He whispered urgently that William couldn't help her by getting himself killed, that attacking English soldiers openly would mean execution for both of them. William struggled against Hamish's grip, every instinct screaming at him to act, but his friend's words penetrated his rage enough to make him stop. The English magistrate appeared, drawn by the commotion. The soldiers explained that Murren had attacked them without provocation, that she'd struck one in the face and should be punished for assaulting the king's men. The magistrate looked at Murren coldly, then ordered the soldiers to take her to the garrison for discipline. Murren called out William's name as they dragged her away, and William stood frozen, held in place by Hamish's strong grip and the knowledge that acting now would doom them both. He watched helplessly as the woman he loved was taken from him, her cries echoing through the village streets. The magistrate decided to make an example of Murren. In his view, allowing a Scottish woman to attack English soldiers and go unpunished would suggest weakness, would encourage others to resist. He ordered that she be executed publicly, in the village square, so everyone could see the price of defiance. William learned of this decision within the hour. He immediately tried to think of ways to rescue her, sneaking into the garrison, negotiating, offering himself in her place. But the garrison was well guarded, and the magistrate had no interest in negotiation. Murren would die before sunset, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to stop it. As the afternoon wore on, villagers gathered reluctantly in the square. No one wanted to witness an execution, especially not of one of their own, but attendance was effectively mandatory. The English soldiers watched to ensure everyone was present, and absence would be seen as an act of rebellion. A rough wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square. Murren was brought out, her hands bound her face showing both fear and a strange kind of calm acceptance. She looked out at the crowd, searching for William, and when their eyes met, something passed between them. Love, sorrow, and goodbye. The magistrate read out the charges in a loud voice, calling Murren a criminal and a threat to the king's peace. He described her crime as assault against soldiers of the crown, an offense punishable by death. His voice carried across the silent square, where people stood with bowed heads, unable to look away, but wishing they could. William stood near the back of the crowd, his whole body rigid with restrained violence. Hamish and several other men surrounded him, physically blocking him from doing anything rash. They whispered urgently that he couldn't save her now, that rushing forward would only mean dying alongside her. But William barely heard them. His eyes were locked on Murren, on the woman who had been his wife for such a short time, the woman who had shown him that life could hold more than just pain and struggle. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but he couldn't move. The executioner stepped forward with a large knife. There was no elaborate mechanism, no formal ceremony. This was a brutal, simple killing, meant to terrify and intimidate. The magistrate gave the order, and the executioner moved quickly. Murren's eyes stayed on William until the very end. She didn't cry out or beg for mercy. Her last expression was one of love, telling him without words that she didn't blame him for not being able to save her. Then it was done. The square fell into absolute silence. Even the English soldiers seemed uncomfortable with what had just happened, though they maintained their stern expressions. The villagers stood frozen, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. William didn't move. He stared at Murren's body on the platform, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes had just seen. Everything inside him had gone cold and still, like a lake freezing over in winter. He didn't feel his heart beating or his lungs breathing. He simply stood there, empty. The magistrate ordered the crowd to disperse, commanding them to return to their homes and remember what happens to those who defy English authority. The soldiers began pushing people away from the square, shouting orders in voices that seemed to come from very far away. Hamish tried to move William, but he wouldn't budge. Several men had to physically pull him backward, guiding him away from the square because his legs wouldn't work properly. They took him to the tavern, sat him down, and tried to get him to drink something. But William just stared at nothing. As evening fell, William finally stood up. He didn't say anything to the men around him. He simply walked out of the tavern with slow, measured steps. Hamish called after him, worried, but William didn't respond. He walked through the darkening village like a man in a dream, moving toward his cottage without really seeing where he was going. Inside his cottage, William stood alone in the darkness. The space he and Murren had been quietly preparing felt like a tomb now. He could smell her scent still in the air, could see the small changes she'd made, a cloth she'd woven hanging by the window, herbs she'd gathered, drying from the rafters. Something broke inside him then. All the careful control he'd maintained, all the restraint that had kept him frozen in the square, shattered like ice under a hammer. He grabbed the table and overturned it with a roar of pure anguish. He punched the stone wall until his knuckles bled, not feeling the pain, just needing to hit something. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't cried when his father died, hadn't cried when his brother died. He'd learned to lock his grief away, to keep moving forward. But this was different. This was the future being murdered, all hope being extinguished, all light being taken from the world. Maren had been innocent. She hadn't been a soldier or a rebel. She'd simply defended herself when threatened, and they'd killed her for it. They'd killed her to make a point, to keep the Scottish people cowed and afraid. And William had stood there and watched it happen, held back by friends who meant well, but who didn't understand that watching her die and doing nothing was worse than death itself. As his initial rage subsided into something colder and more focused, William made a decision. He couldn't bring Maren back, couldn't undo what had been done, but he could make the men who killed her pay. He could make them regret ever coming to Scotland. He could make them understand that Scottish lives had value, that Scottish blood couldn't be spilled without consequence. He thought about his father, about Malcolm's advice to use his head as well as his heart. But right now, William didn't want to be wise or careful. He wanted justice. He wanted revenge, and he was willing to die to get it. William stood slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He moved through his cottage with purpose now, gathering weapons he'd kept hidden, swords, knives, things his uncle had taught him to use. He checked each blade's edge, adjusted his grip, prepared himself mentally for what came next. Outside, night had fully fallen. The village was quiet, everyone locked in their homes, still shaken by what they'd witnessed. The English garrison would be celebrating, probably drunk by now, secure in their power and confident that the execution had reinforced their control. William pulled his cloak around his shoulders and stepped out into the darkness. He moved like a shadow through the empty streets, heading towards the garrison with death in his eyes and a sword in his hand. William reached the garrison without being spotted. It was a fortified house on the edge of the village, with guards posted at the entrance but no real expectation of attack. The English had grown complacent, certain that the Scottish villagers were too frightened and broken to fight back. He studied the building from the shadows, counting guards and noting positions. His uncle's training took over, pushing emotion aside temporarily and replacing it with tactical thinking. He needed to be smart about this if he wanted to succeed. But before he could move, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He spun, hand on his sword, and found Hamish standing there in the darkness. His friend wasn't alone. Several other village men had followed, carrying whatever weapons they could find. Farm tools mostly, a few old swords, some knives. Hamish spoke quietly, saying they weren't going to let William do this alone. What the English had done to Maren was an offence against all of them, and if William was going to strike back, he'd have help. The other men nodded in agreement, their faces grim but determined. William looked at them for a long moment. Part of him wanted to refuse, to tell them to go home and save themselves. But he also understood that this moment was bigger than just his personal grief. These men had been pushed too far, had swallowed too many insults, had watched their families suffer under English cruelty for too long. Maren's death had been the final straw, and they were ready to fight even if it cost them everything. He accepted their help with a simple nod. Then he quickly outlined a plan. They would need to move fast, strike hard, and give the English no time to organize a defense. Speed and surprise were their only advantages against trained soldiers. They split into small groups, approaching the garrison from different directions. William moved to the front entrance, walking calmly toward the guards, as if he had business there. The guards, recognizing him as a villager, didn't immediately see the threat. By the time they noticed his sword, it was too late. William moved with brutal efficiency, using everything his uncle had taught him. He struck down the first guard before the man could cry out, then engaged the second in a brief clash that ended quickly. The door to the garrison stood open before him. Inside, English soldiers were drinking and laughing, completely unprepared for attack. William burst through the door like a storm, and chaos erupted. Men scrambled for weapons, shouting in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. The Scottish villagers poured in after William, attacking with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose. They were farmers and craftsmen, not trained soldiers, but rage gave them strength. They fought with tools and improvised weapons, overwhelming the garrison through sheer ferocity. William moved through the building, searching for one man in particular, the magistrate who had ordered Murren's execution. He found him in an upper room, trying to escape through a window. William grabbed him and pulled him back inside, his face showing no mercy. The magistrate tried to bargain, offering money and pardons, and anything William might want. But William wasn't interested in negotiation. In his mind, he saw Murren's face, her eyes looking at him with love even as she died. He thought about the life they'd planned together, the children they would have had, the peaceful years that had been stolen from them. What happened next was swift and final. William made sure the magistrate understood exactly why he was dying, made sure he knew that Murren's death had consequences. Then it was over. When the fighting ended, the garrison was destroyed. Every English soldier stationed there was dead. The Scottish villagers stood among the bodies, breathing hard, suddenly realizing what they'd done. They'd just killed the king's men, which meant there would be retaliation. The English would send more soldiers, probably an entire army. William walked out of the building and stood in the night air, blood on his hands and clothes. He felt empty again, drained of all emotion. Killing the magistrate hadn't brought Murren back. It hadn't filled the hole in his chest or made anything better. But it had been necessary. A debt paid in blood. Hamish approached him, asking what they should do now. The other men gathered around, looking to William for leadership, even though he hadn't asked for it. They'd followed him into battle, and now they needed direction about what came next. William told them honestly that he didn't know what would happen, but that the English would definitely come for revenge. Any man who had participated in tonight's attack was now marked for death. They could try to run, could scatter to different parts of Scotland and hope the English wouldn't track them all down. Or they could stand and fight, knowing they'd probably die, but at least dying on their feet instead of on their knees. The men looked at each other, having quiet conversations with their eyes. Then, one by one, they said they would fight. If they were going to die anyway, they'd rather die taking English soldiers with them than be hunted down like animals. At least this way, their deaths would mean something. Other villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by the sounds of combat. When they saw what had happened, some were terrified, knowing this meant disaster for everyone. But others looked at the destroyed garrison with fierce satisfaction, seeing justice done for Morone and for all the other indignities they'd suffered. Women brought water and cloth to clean wounds. Old men offered advice about defensive positions. Young boys, eager to help, ran messages between houses. The village was transforming before William's eyes, changing from a collection of frightened victims into something that resembled an army. William realized that he'd started something he couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. His personal act of revenge had become a catalyst for something larger. These people were ready to fight for their freedom, and they were looking to him to lead them. He thought about his uncle's lessons, about strategy and leadership. He thought about his father. about the quiet dignity with which Malcolm had faced death. And he thought about Murren, about how she'd wanted nothing more than a peaceful life, but had been denied even that simple dream. If the English wanted war, William would give them war. Not just for Murren, but for every Scot who had suffered under their rule. He didn't know if they could win, didn't know if Scotland could truly be free. But he knew they had to try, because the alternative was living on their knees, and his father had taught him that some things are worth dying for. News of the attack on the garrison spread quickly. In those days, information travelled through travellers and merchants, through farmers who traded at markets, and priests who moved between villages. Within days, people throughout the region had heard that a man named Wallace had struck back against English occupation, had killed soldiers and a magistrate, and lived to tell about it. The story grew with each telling, as stories do. Some versions said Wallace had single-handedly killed 20 men. Others claimed he was 7 feet tall and could snap swords with his bare hands. The truth didn't matter as much as what the story represented. Proof that the English could be fought, that Scottish courage hadn't been completely crushed. William and his men didn't stay in the village. They couldn't. English retaliation would come soon, and staying would only endanger the innocent people who lived there. Instead, they took to the hills, moving to remote areas where they could hide and plan their next moves. Other men began joining them. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They came from different villages, men who had suffered their own losses under English rule. Some were farmers seeking revenge for stolen land. Others were former soldiers who had been waiting for someone to follow. A few were outlaws already, men who had been living rough and saw opportunity in organized resistance. William found himself leading this growing band without really intending to. He wasn't a nobleman or a trained military commander. He was just a farmer who had been pushed too far. But something about him inspired confidence. Maybe it was his obvious skill with weapons, honed by years of training with his uncle. Maybe it was the cold determination in his eyes that showed he wasn't afraid to die. Or maybe it was simply that he was there, willing to act when others had only talked. Hamish became his closest companion and lieutenant. The big man had a talent for organization, for making sure the growing band had supplies and shelter. He knew the countryside well and could identify good defensive positions. He also provided a balance to William's intensity, offering humor and practical thinking when William became too focused on revenge. They began conducting raids on English positions throughout the region. Small outposts, tax collectors, supply wagons, anything that represented English authority became a target. They struck quickly and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive, using their knowledge of the land to stay one step ahead of pursuit. These weren't glorious battles from legends and songs. They were harsh, brutal affairs, where men died screaming and blood soaked into Scottish soil. But each small victory encouraged more Scots to join the rebellion, and each English defeat made the occupation seem less inevitable. William developed tactics based on his uncle's teachings. He understood that they couldn't fight the English in traditional battles. The English army was too well trained, too well equipped, too numerous. Instead, they had to be smart, had to use speed and surprise and intimate knowledge of the terrain. They had to make the English afraid to travel in small groups, had to turn all of Scotland into hostile territory. The English commanders began to take notice. Reports reached them of increasing unrest, of attacks on their forces, of a man called Wallace, who seemed to be organizing effective resistance. They sent more troops to the region, determined to crush this rebellion before it could spread further. But sending more troops only gave William more targets. The English soldiers didn't know the land, didn't speak the language, didn't understand the people they were trying to control. They moved through Scotland like invaders in a foreign land, which is exactly what they were. As weeks passed, William's reputation grew. Songs were sung about him in taverns, stories were told around fires. To the common people of Scotland, he was becoming a symbol of hope, proof that they didn't have to accept English rule forever. Children played games pretending to be Wallace and his men, and women embroidered the image of a lion rampant onto cloth banners. William himself remained focused on practical matters: where to strike next, how to keep his growing force fed and supplied, how to turn undisciplined volunteers into effective fighters. He thought about Murren constantly, carrying her memory like a physical weight, but he couldn't allow himself to drown in grief. Too many people were depending on him now. At night, when the camp was quiet and his men were sleeping, William would sometimes sit alone and wonder what he'd started. He'd wanted revenge for Murren's death, nothing more. But somehow that simple act of violence had sparked something larger, had tapped into a deep well of Scottish frustration and anger that had been building for years. He wasn't sure where this would lead. He wasn't sure if Scotland could actually win its freedom, or if this rebellion would end with all of them dead or hanged. But he knew they had to keep fighting, because stopping now would mean all the sacrifice had been for nothing. Scotland was not a unified nation in the way we might think of countries today. It was a collection of clans, each with its own territory, traditions, and leaders. These clans sometimes cooperated, but more often they were rivals, competing for land and resources, carrying grudges that stretched back generations. The English had used these divisions to their advantage, playing clans against each other, making alliances with some while crushing others. It was easier to control a divided Scotland than a united one. But William's rebellion was beginning to change this pattern. Stories of his victories reached clan territories throughout the lowlands and into the highlands. Chieftains heard about this Wallace, a commoner who was making the English bleed, who was giving the occupation more trouble than noble-born warriors had managed in years. Some clan leaders dismissed the stories. Wallace was no one important, had no title or lands, came from no distinguished family. In their view, he was just a brigand, causing trouble that would eventually bring English wrath down on all of Scotland. They wanted nothing to do with his rebellion. But other leaders were intrigued. They sent scouts to observe Wallace's forces to see if the stories were exaggerated. These scouts returned with surprising reports. Wallace wasn't just leading a mob. He was building something that resembled an actual army. His men were disciplined, his tactics were effective, and he was winning. Young men from various clans began slipping away to join Wallace, drawn by the promise of action and the appeal of his cause. Their clan leaders sometimes tried to stop them, but you can't completely control young warriors who smell the possibility of glory and freedom. A few clan chieftains decided to make contact with Wallace directly. They sent representatives to his camp, ostensibly to see what he was about, but really to judge whether he was worth supporting. These were cautious approaches. No one wanted to commit too heavily to a cause that might be crushed by English forces at any moment. Wallace received these representatives politely, but bluntly. He told them he wasn't interested in playing political games or negotiating treaties. He was fighting to free Scotland from English rule, and anyone who wanted to help was welcome. Anyone who didn't want to help should at least stay out of his way. Some representatives were offended by his directness, by his refusal to show proper deference to their noble birth. but others were impressed by his honesty and his obvious commitment. They returned to their chieftains with the message that Wallace was the real thing, a genuine leader fighting for Scotland's freedom, not for personal gain or political advantage. Gradually, carefully, some clans began offering support. Not full armies, but supplies, information, places to hide when English forces got too close. It was tentative assistance, the kind that could be withdrawn or denied if things went badly. But it was enough to help Wallace's rebellion grow stronger. In the Highland territories, word of Wallace reached some of the more independent clans, men who valued their freedom above almost everything else, and who had resisted English control more fiercely than their lowland neighbours. These Highland warriors were renowned for their fierceness in battle, though they were also known for being wild and difficult to organise. Some of these Highlanders began making the journey south to see Wallace for themselves. They came in small groups, dressed in their traditional garb, speaking Gaelic and viewing the lowlanders with some suspicion. But they shared a common enemy with Wallace, and that created a bond stronger than regional differences. Wallace welcomed them, recognizing that their fighting skills and knowledge of guerrilla warfare could be valuable. He treated them with respect, listened to their advice, and incorporated their tactics into his overall strategy. In return, they accepted his leadership, seeing in him something they'd been waiting for, someone who could unite Scotland's scattered forces into something powerful enough to threaten English rule. As more groups joined Wallace's rebellion, the challenge became holding them together. These were men from different backgrounds, with different loyalties, sometimes with historical grievances against each other. Creating unity from such diversity required more than just military skill. It required leadership of a different kind. William understood this instinctively. He'd learned from his uncle that people need to believe in something larger than themselves, need to feel part of a cause worth fighting for. He began articulating a vision that went beyond simple revenge against England, beyond even driving out English soldiers. He spoke to his men about Scotland, about what it meant to be Scottish, about the land their ancestors had fought and died for, about the future they were building for their children. He reminded them that they were all Scots first, before they were members of any particular clan or region. Their common identity was more important than their differences. This wasn't a message that came naturally to everyone. Men raised to put clan loyalty above everything else had to learn to see beyond their immediate tribe. But the shared experience of fighting together, bleeding together, surviving together began to create new bonds that transcended old divisions. William also insisted on discipline. A mob could win occasional skirmishes, but building something that could truly challenge English power required organization. He established rules and expectations, made it clear that anyone who joined his force had to follow orders and respect their fellow fighters. He dealt with disputes between men firmly and fairly, never showing favoritism based on where someone came from or what clan they belonged to. If someone caused trouble or refused to follow orders, William dismissed them from his force regardless of their fighting skills. He understood that maintaining unity was more important than having a few extra swords. Training became a daily routine in Wallace's camps. Men who had never held a real weapon before learned basic sword techniques. Farmers who'd spent their lives behind plows practiced formations and coordinated movements. William shared what his uncle had taught him, and veteran fighters passed their knowledge to newcomers. They also developed specific tactics suited to their strengths and weaknesses. Wallace knew they couldn't match English cavalry in open-field combat using traditional methods, so he taught his men to use long spears, pikes that could be braced against the ground to stop charging horses. He showed them how to create defensive formations that turned their lack of armor and formal training into advantages of speed and flexibility. Around the evening fires, stories were shared. Men from the Highlands told tales of their ancestors' battles. Lowlanders shared songs about Scottish heroes from the past. These stories helped create a shared culture, a common understanding of what they were fighting for. They weren't just individual warriors anymore. They were becoming an army with a collective identity. William himself became a unifying figure. He ate the same food as his men, slept on the same ground, took the same risks in battle. He never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. This earned him a loyalty that went beyond normal military hierarchy. His men followed him not just because he was their commander, but because they believed in him personally. Messages began passing between Wallace's force and Scottish nobles who had previously shown no interest in rebellion. These nobles were cautious, still unwilling to openly defy English authority, but they were paying attention. Some sent supplies secretly. Others passed along information about English troop movements. A few even sent their younger sons to fight with Wallace, testing the waters without fully committing themselves. The English commanders noticed this growing unity with alarm. Their reports to King Edward described Wallace not just as a bandit or rebel, but as someone building something that resembled a legitimate Scottish army. The situation was becoming more serious than anyone had initially anticipated. Word reached Wallace that a large English force was being assembled to crush the rebellion once and for all. The English had decided that small patrols and local garrisons weren't enough. They would send a proper army, led by experienced commanders, to put an end to Scottish resistance. The English force would be enormous by the standards of the time. Thousands of soldiers, heavily armored cavalry, professional troops who had fought in wars across Europe. They would march north from England into Scotland, sweeping away any resistance they encountered. The English planned to cross into the heart of Scotland at Stirling, where a narrow bridge spanned a river. Whoever controlled that bridge controlled access to the northern territories. The English were confident that no Scottish force could stand against them, especially not a rabble of farmers and clansmen led by a nobody like Wallace. When Wallace learned of these plans, he called together his commanders, Hamish, several clan leaders who had joined him, and other trusted fighters who had proven themselves in battle. They spread out maps and discussed their options. Some argued they should avoid direct confrontation, should continue their guerrilla tactics, and wait for the English army to exhaust itself, chasing them through the countryside. Others wanted to fight, to show England that Scotland could meet them in open battle. William listened to all the arguments carefully. He understood the risks of fighting such a superior force, but he also understood something more important. This was a moment that could change everything. If they defeated the English army at Stirling, it would prove that Scotland could win major battles, not just small skirmishes. It would inspire every Scot who was still sitting on the fence, still waiting to see if rebellion was viable. It would transform his movement from a troublesome insurgency into a genuine threat to English rule. But if they lost, if his army was destroyed, the rebellion would probably die with it. Everything they'd built, all the hope they'd kindled, would be extinguished. It was the kind of gamble that required absolute commitment, the willingness to risk everything on a single throw. William decided they would fight. They would meet the English at Stirling and either win a great victory or die trying. When he announced this decision, some of his men looked frightened, but most looked determined. They'd followed him this far, and they'd follow him into this battle as well. They began making their way towards Stirling, gathering men as they went. Word spread that Wallace would fight the English at the bridge, and Scottish fighters from across the region began converging on that location. Some came from nearby villages, others travelled for days to join the battle. They came carrying whatever weapons they had, driven by anger and hope and the belief that maybe, just maybe, Scotland could win. As they approached Stirling, Wallace studied the terrain carefully. The bridge was narrow, wide enough for only a few men to cross at a time. On the Scottish side of the river, there were open fields rising to low hills. It was good ground for what he had in mind. He positioned his men on the high ground overlooking the bridge, arranging them in formations he'd taught them. The long spears were distributed, with instructions on exactly how to use them. Archers, what few they had, were placed where they could do the most damage. Every man was told his role and what would be expected of him when the battle began. The English army arrived and made camp on the opposite side of the river. Even from a distance, they looked formidable. Thousands of soldiers in organized ranks, cavalry with armored horses, siege equipment and supply wagons stretching back along the road. The Scottish fighters could see what they were facing, and many must have wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. That night before the battle, Wallace moved through his camp, speaking to his men. He didn't make grand speeches or false promises. He told them honestly that tomorrow would be hard, that many of them would probably die. But he also reminded them why they were there, what they were fighting for. Not for him, not for glory, but for Scotland. For the right to live as free men, to raise their children without fear, to work their own land without English soldiers taking what they'd earned. He asked each man to think about why he'd come, what had brought him to this place. For some, it was dead family members. For others, it was stolen land or brutal treatment. For all of them, it was the accumulation of years of injustice, the weight of occupation that had finally become too heavy to bear. Around the fires that night, men checked their weapons, said prayers, and thought about home. Some wrote messages to loved ones in case they didn't survive. Others simply sat in silence, preparing themselves mentally for what dawn would bring. The mood was somber, but resolute. They'd made their choice, and now they would see it through. Morning came with grey skies and a cool wind. The English army stirred in their camp, preparing for battle with the confidence of professional soldiers. They'd fought in France, in Wales, against far more formidable opponents than Scottish peasants. This would be a simple matter of crossing the bridge and destroying an inferior force. The English commanders were experienced men who had spent their lives in military service. They viewed the upcoming battle as more of an exercise than a genuine contest. Their biggest concern wasn't losing, but ensuring the victory was complete enough to discourage any future Scottish resistance. They assembled their troops in proper military formation, heavy cavalry in the front, infantry behind, archers on the flanks. Everything by the book, exactly as they'd been trained. Their armor gleamed despite the overcast sky, and their banners fluttered in the wind, the English royal standard, and the personal flags of various nobles who commanded different sections of the army. The Scottish force, watching from across the river, looked ragged by comparison. No matching armor, no uniform weapons, no organized units in the English style. Just a mass of men holding spears and whatever else they'd been able to find, arranged in loose formations on the hillside. To the English commanders, this looked like exactly what they expected. Farmers playing at war, about to be taught a harsh lesson about the realities of combat. They didn't see the discipline Wallace had instilled in his men, didn't understand the tactics that had been carefully planned. didn't recognize that sometimes appearances can be deceiving. The English began their crossing, the first ranks of soldiers marching onto the narrow bridge with steady confidence. The bridge could accommodate perhaps 3 or 4 men walking abreast, which meant the crossing would take time. But the English weren't worried about this bottleneck. They assumed the Scots would either flee at the sight of their army or stand and be slaughtered. Wallace watched the English begin to cross, his face calm and expressionless. Beside him, Hamish and other commanders waited for his signal. Around them, the Scottish fighters gripped their weapons tightly, adrenaline making their hearts pound and their breath come faster. The English continued crossing, more and more soldiers moving onto the bridge and across to the Scottish side of the river. They were beginning to form up on the far bank, creating a beachhead that would allow even more of their force to cross safely. Wallace waited. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon, and the English could retreat back across the bridge. Too late, and too many English soldiers would be across, overwhelming his force with sheer numbers. Before giving the order to attack, Wallace rode his horse to a position where his entire army could see him. The moment had come to address his men one final time, to give them the courage they'd need for what was about to happen. He didn't shout or try to whip them into a frenzy. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was strong, but measured, letting his words carry across the assembled force. He told them that the English expected them to run. The English believed that Scots were inferior, that common men couldn't stand against noble-born cavalry and professional soldiers. The English thought this battle was already won. But Wallace said they had something the English didn't have. The English were fighting for their king, for land in a foreign country, for pay and plunder. The Scots were fighting for their homes. They were fighting for the freedom to live without foreign soldiers dictating every aspect of their lives. They were fighting for something worth more than gold or glory. He reminded them that every man there had a choice. They could run now, could disappear into the hills and survive to see another day. No one would think less of them for choosing survival over certain death. The English army was enormous and powerful, and victory was far from guaranteed. But if they ran, if they let fear control their actions, they would live the rest of their lives knowing they'd had a chance to strike a blow for freedom and had chosen safety instead. They would grow old in chains, would watch their children grow up under English rule, would die without ever knowing if Scotland could have been free. Or they could fight. They could stand on this ground and face the enemy, could show England that Scotland wouldn't be conquered quietly. They might die in the next hour, but they would die as free men, on their feet, with weapons in their hands. And if they won, if they somehow managed to defeat this English army, they would change history. They would prove that common men fighting for their homeland could defeat the finest soldiers in Europe. He told them to think about what freedom meant, not just the word, but the reality. The freedom to work their own land and keep what they earned. The freedom to marry without English interference. The freedom to speak their own language, practice their own customs, raise their children as Scots. These weren't abstract ideas. These were real, tangible things worth fighting for. And he told them that no matter what happened in the next few hours, they were already heroes. They'd stood up when others had hidden. They'd fought back when fighting seemed hopeless. They'd proven that Scottish courage hadn't died, that the spirit of their ancestors still lived in them. The men listened in absolute silence, every word sinking in. Some had tears running down their faces. Others stood with jaws clenched, nodding slowly. All of them understood that this was the moment that would define their lives, the choice that would echo through generations. When Wallace finished speaking, he raised his sword high. The Scottish fighters roared in response, a sound that rolled across the fields and made even some of the English soldiers across the river pause and look up nervously. It was the roar of men who had decided to fight, who had chosen freedom over safety, who were ready to die if necessary, but determined to take as many enemies with them as they could. Wallace watched the English continuing to cross the bridge, counting silently. He needed enough of them across to make the battle decisive, but not so many that his force would be overwhelmed. It was a delicate calculation, one that required patience and nerve. Finally, when perhaps half the English force had crossed and was forming up on the Scottish side of the river, Wallace gave the order. The signal passed through his commanders. Now attack now. This was the moment. The Scottish force surged forward down the hillside, moving faster than the English expected. They weren't a disorganized mob, but a coordinated attack, with different groups targeting specific parts of the English formation. The long spears that Wallace had distributed became terrifyingly effective. When the English cavalry tried to charge, expecting to scatter the Scottish force easily, they instead met a wall of sharp points. Horses, bred and trained for war but still animals, refused to charge into certain death. They balked and turned, creating confusion in the English ranks. Scottish fighters swarmed around the stalled cavalry, pulling riders from their horses, attacking with the ferocity of men who knew they couldn't afford to lose. The carefully organized English formation began to break apart, units becoming separated, commanders losing control of their troops. More English soldiers were still trying to cross the bridge, but the narrow passage had become a trap. They couldn't reinforce their comrades quickly enough, could only watch as the battle on the far bank descended into chaos. Wallace had planned for this. While the main Scottish force engaged the English who had already crossed, a smaller group of his best fighters moved towards the bridge itself. Their goal was to cut off the English retreat, to trap the soldiers who had crossed and prevent reinforcements from reaching them. Fighting on the bridge was brutal and close. Men pushed and stabbed in the narrow space, with nowhere to dodge and no room for fancy sword work. It was just raw violence, each side trying to force the other back through sheer determination. The English commanders on the far side of the river realized too late what was happening. Their advance force was being destroyed, and the bridge was becoming choked with bodies, making crossing even more difficult. They tried to organize a relief effort, but the Scottish control of the bridge approaches made this nearly impossible. On the main battlefield, the fighting continued with desperate intensity. English soldiers, trained and experienced, fought hard to save themselves. But the Scottish fighters had advantages the English hadn't anticipated. They knew the ground perfectly. They were fighting for their homes, and Wallace's tactics had nullified many of England's usual advantages. The battle wasn't one-sided. Many Scots fell, cut down by English swords or trampled by horses. Men William had trained and fought beside died screaming, their blood soaking into Scottish soil. But for every Scot who fell, 2 or 3 English soldiers joined them, and the mathematical reality of the battle shifted inexorably in Scotland's favour. As the afternoon wore on, the English position became untenable. The soldiers who had crossed the bridge were being systematically destroyed, and no reinforcements could reach them. The English commanders faced a terrible choice: continue trying to force the bridge and lose more men, or retreat and abandon those soldiers already across the river. They chose retreat. Orders went out to fall back, to withdraw to safer ground and regroup. The English force on the Scottish side of the river, what remained of it, was left to fend for itself. Some English soldiers tried to fight their way back to the bridge, but the Scottish force was too strong now, too confident. Others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. A few managed to escape into the countryside, running for their lives, abandoning armor and weapons in their panic. Wallace's men pursued the fleeing English with fierce determination, cutting down stragglers and ensuring that this defeat would be absolute and unmistakable. They captured English supplies, weapons, and armor. They took horses and equipment that would help supply their own force. When the battle finally ended, the Scottish fighters stood among the bodies, barely able to believe what they'd accomplished. They'd defeated a professional English army, had won a major battle against impossible odds. Men hugged each other and wept, overwhelmed by survival and victory in equal measure. Wallace surveyed the battlefield with mixed emotions. They'd won a great victory, yes, but the cost had been high. Scottish bodies lay scattered across the field alongside English ones. Men he'd known and fought with were dead. Their families would grieve. Their loss would be felt in villages across Scotland. But this sacrifice had purchased something invaluable: hope. Word of this victory would spread across Scotland faster than fire through dry grass. Every Scot who had doubted that freedom was possible would hear about Stirling and reconsider. Every clan that had been sitting on the fence would now have to decide whether to join the rebellion or risk being on the wrong side of history. The English army retreated back across the border, carrying news of their defeat to King Edward. For the first time in years, an English force had been decisively beaten by Scottish fighters. The myth of English invincibility had been shattered. That night, the Scottish camp celebrated, though the celebration was tempered by exhaustion and loss. Men sat around fires, sharing food and drink, telling stories about the battle that would grow into legends in the years to come. They sang old Scottish songs, their voices carrying across the dark fields. William didn't join the celebration. He walked among the wounded, speaking to men who had fought for him, offering what comfort he could to those who were dying. He made sure the dead were treated with respect, that arrangements were made to return bodies to their families when possible. Hamish found him sitting alone later that night, looking out over the dark landscape. His friend sat down beside him in silence for a while, then spoke quietly about how Malcolm would have been proud, how William had led these men to something no one thought possible. William nodded, but didn't smile. He was thinking about what came next, about how King Edward would respond to this defeat. The English wouldn't accept this humiliation quietly. They'd send more armies, bigger ones, led by better commanders. This victory at Stirling was just the beginning, not the end. But for tonight, Scotland had won. For tonight, freedom seemed possible. And that was enough. News of the victory at Stirling reached every corner of Scotland within days. The Scottish nobles, who had been cautious and hesitant about the rebellion, suddenly saw Wallace in a new light. He was no longer just a troublesome commoner. He was a military leader who had accomplished what they had failed to do. A gathering was arranged at a location chosen for its symbolic importance, an old stone church that represented Scottish tradition and independence. The nobles came in their finest clothes, representing various regions and clans. Some came because they genuinely supported Wallace's cause, others because they couldn't afford to appear disloyal to someone who had become a national hero. William arrived at this gathering wearing simple clothes, still looking more like a farmer than a noble. He was uncomfortable with the formality of the occasion, with the pageantry and political maneuvering that nobles seemed to specialize in. But he understood that this recognition mattered, that it would give his rebellion legitimacy, in the eyes of people who cared about such things. The Scottish nobles conducted a ceremony to knight William, conferring upon him the title of Guardian of Scotland. It was meant to recognize his role as protector of the realm, as the man leading the fight for Scottish freedom. They spoke flowery words about his courage and his victory, praising him in terms that made him seem larger than life. William knelt for the ceremony, because protocol required it, but his face showed his skepticism about all this formality. These same nobles had done nothing while Scotland suffered under English rule. They'd protected their own lands and privileges while common people starved or were abused. Now they wanted to associate themselves with his success, to claim some credit for the victory they'd had no part in winning. But William accepted the knighthood because it served his purpose. The title would help him rally more support, would make it easier to coordinate with clan leaders who cared about rank and status. If playing their political games meant more men and resources for the fight against England, he'd play along. After the ceremony, the nobles held a feast. Tables were laden with food and drink, musicians played, and the atmosphere was celebratory. The nobles congratulated each other as if they'd personally won the battle, making speeches and toasts that emphasized their own importance. William sat at the high table, as was now expected of someone with his new rank, but he remained quiet and watchful. He observed how these nobles interacted with each other, the alliances and rivalries that bubbled beneath their courteous words. He was learning about this world of politics and power, understanding that military victories alone wouldn't be enough to free Scotland. One nobleman in particular caught his attention, Robert the Bruce, a man perhaps a few years younger than William, who came from one of Scotland's most powerful families. The Bruce had his own claim to the Scottish throne, a legitimate genealogical right that many respected. He was educated, sophisticated, everything William was not. The two men spoke briefly at the feast, sizing each other up. Robert was clearly intrigued by William, curious about this commoner who had achieved what nobles had failed to do. William, in turn, saw someone torn between personal ambition and national loyalty, someone who wanted Scotland to be free, but who also wanted power for himself. Their conversation was polite but guarded, each man recognizing that they might be allies or rivals, depending on how future events unfolded. There was respect between them, but also wariness. They were too different, came from two different worlds, to easily trust each other. King Edward Longshanks received news of the defeat at Stirling with cold fury. He was an old man now, but still sharp and ruthless. He understood that this rebellion was becoming a serious threat to English control of Scotland, and he was determined to crush it by any means necessary. But Edward was also practical. Before committing more military resources, he decided to try other methods. He sent representatives to Scotland with offers for Wallace, land, titles, gold, anything William might want if he would simply stop fighting and accept English authority. The English envoys found Wallace in a temporary camp, surrounded by his men. They came with elegant clothes and refined manners, treating the negotiation as a business transaction. They explained that King Edward recognized Wallace's abilities and would be willing to reward him generously in exchange for peace. They offered him noble titles, estates, wealth beyond what a common farmer could imagine. They painted a picture of a comfortable life, suggesting that William could do more for Scotland by working within the English system than by fighting against it. They implied that continued resistance would only bring more suffering to the Scottish people, that William was being selfish by refusing to compromise. William listened to all of this without interruption, his face expressionless. When the envoys finished their pitch, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave them his answer, speaking in a voice that was calm, but absolutely firm. He told them that Scotland's freedom wasn't for sale, not for any amount of gold or promises of power. He said that he hadn't fought at Stirling, so that he could live comfortably while his countrymen remained enslaved. Every Scot who had died in the rebellion had died for something larger than personal gain, and he wouldn't dishonor their sacrifice by accepting English bribes. He explained that King Edward didn't understand what he was fighting, didn't comprehend that some things matter more than wealth or status. A man who would trade his country's freedom for personal comfort wasn't really a man at all. Just a coward wearing a human shape. The envoys were shocked by this rejection. They'd been certain that Wallace, being common-born, would jump at the chance for nobility and riches. They tried to argue, to make him see reason, to explain that he was throwing away an incredible opportunity. But William dismissed them, making it clear the conversation was over. His men watched with fierce approval, proud that their leader couldn't be bought. The English envoys left empty-handed, carrying back to King Edward the message that Wallace would never surrender, never compromise, never accept anything less than complete Scottish independence. When Edward heard this response, he understood that military force would be necessary after all. He began making plans for a massive campaign into Scotland, one that would finally end this rebellion and crush Wallace permanently. Throughout Scotland, William Wallace's name was celebrated in ways he couldn't control and often didn't appreciate. Songs were written about him, stories were told. His reputation grew far beyond the reality of who he actually was. In taverns across the country, men drank toasts to Wallace, speaking his name with reverence usually reserved for saints. In villages, mothers told their children stories about the brave warrior who was fighting for their freedom. In churches, priests invoked his name in prayers, asking God to protect Scotland's champion. This celebrity made William deeply uncomfortable. He'd never sought fame or adoration, had never wanted to be anyone's hero. He'd started fighting because of personal loss, because of Murron, because he couldn't stand by and watch injustice continue. The fact that his personal war had transformed into a national movement felt almost accidental. But he understood that his symbolic importance was now larger than his actual military role. To the common people of Scotland, he represented hope, the possibility that their lives could change, that English rule wasn't permanent and inevitable. He was proof that ordinary people could make history, could stand up to power and win. This meant he had to be careful about his actions and his image. Men who might never meet him personally were willing to die in his name, following the legend rather than the man. That kind of influence came with heavy responsibility. Communities that had been divided now found unity in support of Wallace's cause. Clans that had been feuding for generations found common ground in their desire to be free from England. The rebellion was creating a Scottish national identity that transcended local loyalties. English-held territories in Scotland became increasingly difficult to govern. Tax collectors found themselves threatened or attacked. English merchants faced boycotts. Scots who had been cooperating with the occupation found themselves ostracized by their neighbors. The entire country was becoming hostile territory for England. William continued to lead his forces in military operations, but he was also being pulled into political and organizational roles. He had to coordinate between different Scottish factions, had to make decisions about strategy and resource allocation, had to become a leader in ways that went far beyond simple military command. At night, when he had moments alone, William sometimes thought about the life he'd imagined with Murren. The simple, peaceful existence they'd planned seemed impossibly distant now. He'd become someone he'd never intended to be, caught up in forces larger than himself. But he also knew there was no going back. Too many people were depending on him. Too much Scottish blood had been spilled. He had to see this through, to whatever end awaited, whether that was victory and freedom, or death and defeat. In England, King Edward Longshanks sat in his council chambers, studying maps and reports about the Scottish situation. He was elderly now, his body weakening with age, but his mind remained sharp and his will undiminished. He'd spent his entire life building and consolidating power, and he wasn't about to let a Scottish rebellion undo his work. Edward understood that the defeat at Stirling had been more than just a military setback. It had been a blow to English prestige. If Scotland successfully won its independence, it would encourage rebellion in other territories England controlled. Wales might rise up again. Ireland might see opportunity. The entire structure of English power could begin to crumble. He decided that the next campaign against Scotland would be overwhelming and final. He would personally lead the largest army England could muster, would bring such force to bear that Scottish resistance would be crushed permanently. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no possibility of anything less than complete submission. Edward was also realistic about the political situation. He knew that simply defeating Wallace in battle wouldn't necessarily end the rebellion. Wallace had become a symbol, and symbols can survive military defeat. So Edward planned to use other methods as well. Bribery, intimidation, exploitation of Scottish political divisions. He understood that the Scottish nobles were a weakness in Wallace's movement. These men had their own ambitions, their own desires for power and wealth. Some could probably be bought or threatened into betraying the rebellion. Creating division among the Scots would be just as important as military victory. Edward's son, Prince Edward, was present during many of these planning sessions. The prince was a disappointment to his father in many ways, weak-willed, more interested in pleasure than duty, lacking the ruthless determination that had made his father a successful king. But he was still the heir, and Longshanks tried to prepare him for the responsibilities he would eventually inherit. The king explained to his son that ruling wasn't just about military might. It was about understanding human nature, about knowing when to use force and when to use cunning. He taught the prince that most men have their price, that loyalty can usually be bought or broken, that fear is often more effective than affection in maintaining control. Preparations began for the new campaign. Soldiers were recruited throughout England and from Allied territories on the continent. Supplies were gathered, weapons were forged, horses were trained. The English military machine ground into motion, preparing to march north and settle the Scottish question once and for all. Longshanks knew this would likely be his last great military campaign. His health was declining, his body failing him, but he was determined to crush Scotland before he died, to ensure that his son inherited a secure and unified kingdom. The Scottish rebellion would end, and Wallace would die, and England's dominion over the entire island would be absolute. As part of his political maneuvering, King Edward arranged a marriage for his son. The bride would be Princess Isabella of France, a young woman whose family connections would strengthen England's position in European politics. The marriage was purely strategic, designed to secure French neutrality or support in England's conflicts. Isabella arrived in England for the wedding, accompanied by a French entourage. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, that seemed to see more than most people expected. She'd been raised in the sophisticated French court and had received an education unusual for women of her time. She understood that her marriage was political, that her feelings and preferences were irrelevant to the arrangement. This was simply how royal marriages worked. Women were traded like valuable commodities to seal alliances and advance dynastic interests. But understanding something intellectually doesn't make it easier to accept emotionally. The wedding ceremony was elaborate, filled with pageantry and formal declarations of love that neither party felt. Prince Edward went through the motions without enthusiasm, already thinking about the pleasures and diversions he'd return to once the formalities were complete. Isabella stood beside him, maintaining perfect composure while privately wondering what kind of life she'd been sold into. After the wedding, Isabella found herself in a strange position. She was the Princess of Wales, wife to the heir of the English throne, but she had no real power or influence. Prince Edward showed little interest in her, beyond what was minimally required by duty. She was surrounded by a court that viewed her as a foreign curiosity, beautiful, but ultimately irrelevant to English politics. She began learning about the Scottish situation, partly because it dominated court conversations, and partly because she was genuinely curious. The stories she heard about Wallace intrigued her, a common man who had somehow become a national hero, who had defeated English armies and rejected bribes, who seemed to be fighting for principles rather than personal gain. The English court spoke about Wallace with contempt and hatred, calling him a traitor and a murderer. But Isabella detected something else beneath their words. Fear. They were afraid of him, afraid of what he represented, afraid that his rebellion might actually succeed. She found herself sympathizing with the Scottish cause, though she was careful not to express these feelings openly. There was something admirable about people fighting for their freedom, about refusing to accept oppression even when resistance seemed hopeless. It reminded her that she too was trapped, in a different way, by forces beyond her control. Isabella was intelligent enough to understand the hypocrisy of her situation. She lived in luxury, wanted for nothing materially, yet she had no freedom to choose her own life. In some ways, she had more in common with the oppressed Scots than with the English royalty she'd married into. She kept these thoughts to herself, playing the role of dutiful princess while privately nurturing a growing interest in the Scottish rebellion and the man leading it. William Wallace decided that Scotland needed to take the fight to England itself. Defensive victories weren't enough. He needed to show that Scotland could strike English territory, could make England feel unsafe in its own lands. This would demonstrate Scottish strength and might discourage English aggression. He led a large force across the border into northern England, targeting the city of York. This was a bold, almost reckless move. York was a significant English city, well protected and deep inside English territory. Attacking it required moving a Scottish army far from friendly land, exposing them to potential encirclement and destruction. But William understood the psychological value of the raid. If he could attack York successfully, it would shatter English confidence and show that Scotland was strong enough to threaten England directly. It would also distract from English preparations to invade Scotland, forcing them to worry about defending their own territory. The Scottish force moved quickly through northern England, avoiding major garrisons and travelling through countryside that didn't expect to see an enemy army. They reached York and launched their attack with the same fierce determination they'd shown at Stirling. The city's defences were not prepared for such an assault. York's garrison was accustomed to peaceful times, not to facing a determined Scottish army. The fighting was brutal, with Scottish forces pressing their advantage and showing no mercy to those who had supported the occupation of their homeland. When the city fell, Wallace made sure that his message to King Edward would be unmistakable. Scottish fighters raised their banners over English walls, a powerful symbol of Scottish strength. They took supplies and weapons, strengthening their own force while weakening England's. But Wallace also made sure that the attack was controlled. He didn't allow indiscriminate slaughter of civilians or unnecessary destruction. He wanted England to fear Scottish military power, not to hate Scotland for senseless cruelty. There was a difference between strategic violence and mere revenge. Before withdrawing back to Scotland, William sent a message directly to King Edward. The exact words varied in different accounts, but the meaning was clear. Scotland would not be conquered, and any English army that entered Scottish territory would face determined resistance. The message was delivered with arrows shot into English positions, carrying declarations of Scottish independence. The raid on York accomplished what William intended. English confidence was shaken, and King Edward's fury at the humiliation drove him to even more aggressive planning. But it also demonstrated that Scotland could project power, could threaten England on its own ground. The psychological balance had shifted. When the Scottish force returned home, they were greeted as heroes. The raid had cost them relatively few casualties while inflicting significant damage on English prestige. Men who had participated in the attack told stories that grew with each retelling, cementing Wallace's reputation as a military genius. But William knew that the raid had also guaranteed King Edward's personal involvement in the next campaign. The English king couldn't ignore such a direct challenge. A massive English invasion of Scotland was now inevitable, and when it came, it would be led by one of the most ruthless and effective military commanders in Europe. King Edward, hoping to find a diplomatic solution before launching his military campaign, sent representatives to negotiate with Wallace. Among these representatives was Princess Isabella. The king thought that sending his daughter-in-law might soften Wallace, might appeal to whatever chivalrous instincts he possessed. It was also a test of Isabella's loyalty and her willingness to serve English interests. Isabella travelled north with a small entourage, moving towards the Scottish borderlands, where Wallace had agreed to meet English representatives. The journey gave her time to think about what she would say, how she would approach this man who had become such a significant figure in her imagination. They met in a tent set up in neutral territory, far from either army. William arrived with just a few guards, showing neither fear nor excessive caution. He entered the tent and found Isabella waiting for him, dressed simply for travel, but still unmistakably royal in her bearing. Their first meeting was formal and careful. Isabella began with the message she'd been instructed to deliver. Offers of negotiation, suggestions that continued fighting would only bring suffering to both nations, hints that King Edward might be willing to make concessions if Wallace would accept some form of English authority over Scotland. William listened politely, but with obvious skepticism. He'd heard similar offers before and had rejected them. He responded that Scotland's freedom was not negotiable, that no amount of diplomatic language could disguise the fundamental question. Would Scotland govern itself or continue under English rule? But as they talked, something unexpected happened. Isabella found herself speaking more honestly than she'd intended, moving beyond her scripted message to engage with Wallace as a person, rather than as an enemy. She asked him about his cause, about what drove him to continue fighting against such overwhelming odds. William, perhaps recognizing something genuine in her interest, answered more openly than he might have with other English representatives. He spoke about his father, about Murron, about watching his people suffer under occupation. He explained that freedom wasn't just a political abstraction. It was the ability to live without fear, to work your own land, to raise children who wouldn't be subject to foreign cruelty. Isabella listened and found herself moved by his sincerity. Here was someone fighting for principles rather than personal gain, willing to sacrifice everything for a cause larger than himself. It was so different from the cynical political maneuvering she'd witnessed at the English court, where every action was calculated for personal advantage. She admitted, perhaps more than she should have, that she understood something about lacking freedom. Her marriage had been arranged without her consent, her life dictated by political necessity. She lived in a cage made of silk and gold, but it was still a cage. Wallace's fight for Scottish independence resonated with her own unspoken desire for autonomy. William looked at her differently after this admission, seeing past the title and the elegant clothes to the person beneath. They were both, in different ways, trapped by forces larger than themselves. He by the responsibility his rebellion had created. She by the political marriage that had made her a pawn in games she didn't control. Their conversation continued longer than either had expected, ranging across topics that had nothing to do with diplomacy. They spoke about loss and duty, about the price of loyalty and the weight of responsibility. There was an unexpected connection between them, a recognition of shared humanity, despite being on opposite sides of a conflict. When Isabella finally returned to the English court, she carried Wallace's formal rejection of the peace terms, but she also carried something else, a growing sympathy for the Scottish cause and a personal respect for the man leading it. She reported to King Edward that Wallace would not negotiate, that military action was the only remaining option. But privately, she found herself hoping that Wallace would somehow survive what was coming, that his cause might succeed, even though that would mean her father-in-law's defeat. These were dangerous thoughts for someone in her position, and she kept them carefully hidden. But they were there, growing stronger with each passing day. As King Edward's massive army prepared to invade Scotland, tensions began emerging among the Scottish forces. The unity that had developed after Stirling started to fracture under the pressure of impending conflict and the competing ambitions of different leaders. The Scottish nobles who had supported Wallace after his victories now began questioning his leadership. Some argued that he was too reckless, that attacking York had provoked England unnecessarily. Others worried that his commoner origins made him unsuitable to represent Scotland in negotiations with other kingdoms. A few nursed private ambitions, wanting power for themselves, and seeing Wallace as an obstacle to their own advancement. Robert the Bruce was particularly conflicted. He genuinely admired Wallace's courage and effectiveness, but he also believed that Scotland needed noble leadership, someone with legitimate claim to the throne, who could rally international support. He thought that perhaps Wallace should step aside or serve under noble command, allowing the rebellion to transform into a more traditional political movement. William sensed these divisions and found them frustrating. He'd never sought leadership or titles, had never wanted to compete with nobles for power and prestige. He was fighting for Scotland's freedom, and the political maneuvering of ambitious men seemed like a dangerous distraction from that central goal. He met with the Scottish nobles to discuss strategy for confronting King Edward's invasion. The meeting quickly became contentious, with different factions proposing different approaches. Some wanted to negotiate with England, seeking the best terms they could get rather than risking total defeat. Others wanted to fight, but disagreed about tactics and command structure. William argued for unity, reminding them that internal division was exactly what England wanted and expected. He pointed out that if they fought among themselves, Edward wouldn't need to defeat them. They'd destroy their own cause through infighting and betrayal. But his words didn't fully overcome the nobles' suspicions and ambitions. They agreed to coordinate their forces for the upcoming battle, but the agreement felt fragile, built on necessity rather than genuine trust. William left the meeting worried about what these divisions might mean when they faced the English army. Hamish, always practical, suggested that they should be prepared for betrayal. He'd seen how nobles operated, how they protected their own interests above all else. He urged William to position their most loyal fighters where they could respond if any Scottish forces suddenly switched sides or withdrew from battle. William resisted this pessimistic thinking, wanting to believe that when the fighting started, all Scots would remember their common cause. But he also couldn't completely dismiss Hamish's concerns. He'd learned enough about politics to understand that not everyone shared his commitment to freedom above personal advantage. Rumours began circulating through the Scottish camps about secret negotiations between certain nobles and English representatives. Some claimed that deals were being made, that promises of land and titles were being offered in exchange for betrayal. It was impossible to know which rumours were true and which were simply the product of fear and suspicion. The atmosphere in the Scottish force became tense and uncertain. Men looked at each other with mistrust, wondering who might turn traitor when battle was joined. The solidarity that had carried them through Stirling felt like it was eroding, replaced by doubt and division. William tried to hold everything together through force of personality and appeals to Scottish patriotism. He moved through the camps, speaking to men from different clans, reminding them what they were fighting for. He emphasized that they'd already proven Scotland could defeat England, that victory was possible if they stayed united. But he couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't personally convince every doubter or neutralize every ambitious noble's scheming. He was watching his army potentially fracture at the worst possible moment, just as King Edward's forces were approaching. Robert the Bruce embodied the contradictions facing many Scottish nobles. He had legitimate claim to the Scottish throne through his family lineage, a claim that many respected and supported. He'd been raised to expect power, trained from childhood to see himself as a natural leader of Scotland. But he also genuinely cared about Scotland's freedom and admired what Wallace had accomplished. Unlike some nobles who only saw opportunity in the rebellion, Robert actually believed in the cause. He wanted Scotland to be independent, wanted his people to be free from English rule. His problem was that he also wanted to be king, not just because of personal ambition, though that was certainly part of it, but because he believed he was the right person for the role. He thought Scotland needed a noble-born leader with international connections and political sophistication, someone who could navigate the complex world of medieval diplomacy. Wallace, in Robert's view, was an excellent military commander, but not the right person to lead Scotland in the long term. The other kingdoms of Europe wouldn't respect or recognize a commoner as Scotland's legitimate ruler. Even if Wallace won military victories, he couldn't provide the political legitimacy that Scotland needed to survive as an independent nation. Robert's father, also named Robert Bruce, but known as Bruce the Elder, pressured his son constantly about these issues. The elder Bruce was a pragmatic, calculating man who saw the rebellion primarily through the lens of personal advantage. He urged his son to position himself to seize power when the opportunity arose, to use Wallace's military success as a stepping stone to the throne. The younger Bruce was torn between his father's cynical advice and his own somewhat more idealistic instincts. He met with Wallace several times, trying to find a way to work together, to combine Wallace's military leadership with Bruce's political legitimacy. But these meetings were always slightly awkward, both men circling around the fundamental question of who would ultimately lead Scotland. William made it clear that he had no interest in being king, that his only goal was Scottish freedom. He said that once Scotland was independent, the nobles could sort out questions of governance and succession. But first, they had to win that freedom, and everything else was secondary. Robert wanted to believe this, wanted to trust that Wallace would step aside when the time came. But his father and other advisers filled his ears with warnings about commoners who got a taste of power and refused to relinquish it, about the dangers of letting someone without noble birth become too influential. As King Edward's invasion drew closer, Robert had to make increasingly difficult choices. His father urged him to make secret contact with English representatives, to have a backup plan in case the battle went badly. The elder Bruce argued that nobility had survived for centuries by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate, by never putting all resources behind a single cause. Robert resisted these suggestions initially, feeling that they represented betrayal. But as the military situation became more precarious and the divisions among Scottish forces became more apparent, he began to wonder if his father might be right. Perhaps pure idealism was a luxury that nobility couldn't afford. Perhaps protecting his family's position required being willing to make uncomfortable compromises. He didn't make any firm commitments to England, but he also didn't completely close the door to negotiation. He kept his options open, telling himself this was just prudent planning, that he was ensuring his family could survive regardless of the battle's outcome. But part of him knew that this hedging of bets was already a form of betrayal, a failure to fully commit to the cause he claimed to support. King Edward's massive army finally entered Scotland, moving north with inexorable determination. The English force was enormous. Thousands of heavily armored cavalry, professional infantry, archers from Wales, siege equipment, supply trains that stretched for miles. It was the largest army that had invaded Scotland in generations. Wallace assembled his forces to meet this threat, positioning them near the town of Falkirk. He'd chosen the ground carefully, trying to use terrain to offset England's numerical advantage. His men dug defensive positions, prepared stakes to hinder cavalry charges, and readied themselves for the battle that would determine Scotland's fate. The Scottish force was substantial, but not as unified as it needed to be. The various noble contingents maintained some separation, their commanders coordinating with Wallace, but keeping their own counsel. There was an undercurrent of tension, the divisions that had been developing over previous weeks now barely concealed. On the morning of battle, William addressed his troops one final time. He reminded them of what they'd already accomplished, of the victories they'd won together. He spoke about Scotland's freedom, about fighting for their children and their children's children. He urged them to stand together, to trust each other, to remember that they were all Scots first. The English army approached in perfect formation, their banners flying, their armor gleaming. King Edward personally commanded them, his presence ensuring discipline and coordination. The English moved with professional confidence, soldiers who knew they vastly outnumbered their opponents. The battle began with the English cavalry charging the Scottish positions. William's men held firm, their long spears creating a defensive wall that stopped the initial attacks. For a while, it seemed that Scottish tactics might work again, that they could defeat the English despite being outnumbered. But then disaster struck. Some of the Scottish noble contingents, including forces that Robert the Bruce had brought to the battle, suddenly withdrew from the field. They didn't attack their own side, but they pulled back, leaving gaps in the Scottish lines at critical moments. The reasons for this betrayal were complex and varied. Some nobles had made secret agreements with England, accepting promises of land and titles in exchange for abandoning the field. Others simply lost their nerve when they saw the size of the English army, deciding that survival was more important than honor. A few, including possibly Robert, may have genuinely believed that further fighting was pointless, and that saving their forces for another day was the wiser choice. Whatever their reasons, the result was catastrophic for Wallace's army. The gaps created by the withdrawing nobles allowed English forces to flank and surround the Scottish fighters who remained. Men who had been holding defensive positions suddenly found themselves exposed and vulnerable. William fought desperately to hold his lines together, to rally his men and adjust to the collapsing situation. But there were too many English soldiers attacking from too many directions. His force began to break apart, units becoming separated, the cohesive defense dissolving into scattered pockets of resistance. The battle at Falkirk became a slaughter. The Scottish fighters who remained loyal to Wallace, mostly common soldiers rather than noble-led contingents, fought with incredible courage, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. English cavalry circled the trapped Scottish formations, attacking repeatedly. Welsh archers, positioned on nearby hills, rained arrows down on the Scottish positions. The carefully prepared defences that might have worked against a straightforward assault became death traps once the Scottish line was broken. William fought in the thick of the combat, his sword red with blood, trying to create escape routes for his men. Hamish stayed close beside him, the two friends fighting back to back as they'd done in so many previous battles. Around them, men they'd trained and fought with were dying, cut down by English swords or pierced by arrows. The noise was overwhelming. Screams of wounded men, clash of metal on metal, shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the chaos. The ground became slippery with blood, and bodies piled up in drifts where the fighting was most intense. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the battle was lost. The only question now was how many Scots could escape before being completely destroyed. William gave orders for a retreat, telling his remaining men to scatter and flee in different directions to save themselves however they could. The retreat was chaotic and desperate. Men ran for the cover of nearby woods, pursued by English cavalry. Some made it to safety, others were cut down from behind. The proud Scottish army that had won at Stirling was being destroyed, and there was nothing William could do to stop it. He remained on the battlefield longer than he should have, trying to give his men time to escape, accepting risks that his commanders begged him not to take. Several times he nearly died, saved only by Hamish's intervention or by simple luck. Finally, when there was no one left to save, and staying meant certain death, William allowed himself to be pulled away from the carnage. They fled north, a small group of survivors moving through the countryside under cover of darkness. Behind them, the English army controlled the battlefield, celebrating their victory and hunting down any Scots they could find. The losses were staggering. Thousands of Scottish fighters had died at Falkirk, men from all over Scotland who had believed in the cause of freedom and had paid for that belief with their lives. Entire villages would mourn, would find themselves without fathers, brothers, and sons. William rode through the night in a daze of grief and exhaustion. He kept seeing the faces of men who had trusted him, who had followed his leadership into a battle that had become a trap. The betrayal by the Scottish nobles burned in his mind, almost worse than the military defeat itself. Hamish, riding beside him, was uncharacteristically silent. His usual humor was gone, replaced by grim contemplation of what they'd witnessed. Other survivors rode with them, wounded men who could barely stay in their saddles, but who kept moving out of sheer determination to survive. When they finally stopped to rest, hidden in a dense forest, far from English patrols, the full weight of the disaster began to sink in. The rebellion that had seemed so promising after Stirling was in ruins. Most of their army was dead or scattered. The nobles who might have provided leadership and resources had proven unreliable at best and traitorous at worst. William sat apart from the others, staring into the darkness, wrestling with the question of whether to continue fighting or accept that the cause was lost. He thought about all the men who had died, believing he could lead them to victory, about the trust they'd placed in him that he'd been unable to honor. In the weeks following Falkirk, William learned the details of the betrayal. He discovered which nobles had made deals with England, which ones had simply fled, and who had been responsible for the catastrophic collapse of his lines. One name kept appearing in the accounts: Lord Mornay, a Scottish noble who had explicitly promised to support Wallace, but who had withdrawn his forces at a critical moment. Evidence suggested that Mornay had been bribed by the English, had taken gold in exchange for betraying Scotland at the moment when loyalty mattered most. William became obsessed with finding Mornay. It wasn't just about revenge, though he certainly wanted that. It was about justice, about making it clear that betrayal had consequences, that Scottish nobles couldn't sell out their country without paying a price. He tracked Mornay with a small group of loyal men, moving quietly through the countryside, gathering information about the nobleman's whereabouts. Mornay was trying to keep a low profile, aware that many Scots wanted him dead, but believing that English protection would keep him safe. They found Mornay in a manor house, surrounded by guards, but not the massive security a truly threatened man would maintain. He'd grown complacent, assuming that Wallace was too weakened after Falkirk to pose any real danger. William and his men attacked the manor at night, moving with the stealth and efficiency of experienced fighters. They overcame the guards quickly, then burst into Mornay's chambers, where the nobleman lay sleeping, secure in his false sense of safety. Mornay woke to find Wallace standing over him, sword in hand and fury in his eyes. The nobleman tried to talk his way out, offering excuses and justifications for his actions at Falkirk. He claimed he'd been trying to save his men, that continuing the fight would have been suicide, that anyone would have made the same choice. William wasn't interested in listening to excuses. He'd lost too many good men because of Mornay's treachery, had watched Scotland's best chance for freedom collapse because nobles valued gold more than honor. He carried out an execution that was swift but brutal, making sure that word would spread about what happened to traitors. The revenge brought William no real satisfaction. Killing Mornay didn't bring back the dead, didn't undo the disaster at Falkirk, didn't restore Scotland's army. But it did send a message. Wallace was still alive, still fighting, and betrayal would not be forgotten or forgiven. Other nobles who had betrayed the cause became more cautious after Mornay's death. Some fled to England, seeking protection from King Edward. Others went into hiding, afraid that Wallace would come for them next. A few tried to rejoin the rebellion, offering apologies and promises that they'd learned their lesson. William accepted none of these reconciliations. Trust, once broken, couldn't be easily repaired. He continued fighting, but now with a much smaller force, avoiding major battles and returning to the guerrilla tactics he'd used in the early days of the rebellion. He was still dangerous, still a threat to English occupation, but he was no longer leading a national movement toward independence. In the years following Falkirk, William Wallace continued his resistance, but his role began to change. He was no longer the leader of a unified Scottish army, no longer capable of fighting major battles against English forces. Instead, he became something more abstract and perhaps more powerful, a symbol of Scottish resistance that couldn't be destroyed, even when his military effectiveness was diminished. Stories about Wallace spread throughout Scotland and beyond. Songs were written about his battles and his refusals to compromise. Common people invoked his name when they resisted English authority in small ways. His reputation grew larger than life, with tales attributing to him achievements that were exaggerated or entirely fictional. This mythic status was useful in some ways. It kept the idea of Scottish independence alive, even when actual independence seemed impossible. It inspired others to continue resisting, to believe that freedom was worth fighting for. But it also isolated William from normal human connection, made it harder for him to simply be a man rather than a legend. He moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough for English forces to track him down. He lived rough, camping in forests and abandoned buildings, always on the move. His small band of loyal followers dwindled over time as men died or drifted away, unable to sustain the endless fugitive existence. Hamish remained with him throughout, the one constant companion who remembered William as he'd been before all of this. Just a farmer from a small village who'd lost the woman he loved. Their friendship provided some stability, some connection to the person William had been before becoming Wallace the Rebel. King Edward, frustrated by his inability to capture Wallace despite his military superiority, offered increasingly large rewards for information leading to his arrest. The price on William's head became enormous, enough gold to make even loyal supporters think twice about protecting him. English soldiers conducted raids throughout Scotland, searching for Wallace and punishing anyone suspected of helping him. Villages were burned, people were tortured for information, families were destroyed in the pursuit of one man. The English occupation became more brutal and oppressive, with Edward determining that if he couldn't capture Wallace easily, he'd make the entire country suffer until someone betrayed him. This created a terrible dilemma for Wallace. His continued resistance was providing inspiration, but was also causing immense suffering for ordinary Scots who were punished for his actions. He sometimes wondered if surrendering would save innocent people from English cruelty, if his symbolic importance was worth the actual cost in Scottish lives. But he also understood that surrendering would validate everything England had done, would prove that resistance was futile, would crush whatever hope remained for Scottish independence. His existence as a free man, still defying English authority after years of pursuit, mattered more than his actual military achievements. Princess Isabella had been watching the Scottish situation with increasing concern and secret sympathy. The disaster at Falkirk had given her no pleasure, despite being married into the English royal family. She'd seen how King Edward had become increasingly obsessed with capturing Wallace, how the old king's health was failing, but his determination to crush Scotland remained undiminished. She had also learned more about Wallace through various sources: intelligence reports, diplomatic communications, stories from Scotland. Everything she learned reinforced her original impression that he was fighting for something genuine and admirable, that his cause was just even if his methods were sometimes brutal. Isabella had become more sophisticated in her understanding of court politics. She'd learned how to gather information, how to cultivate relationships with people who knew useful things, how to appear loyal while privately harboring thoughts that would be considered treasonous if anyone discovered them. When she learned that English soldiers had nearly captured Wallace in a raid on a safe house, she made a decision that could have cost her everything. She managed to get a warning to him through intermediaries, tipping him off about the trap that had been set. The warning reached William just in time. He and his men escaped minutes before English soldiers surrounded the building. It was a close call, closer than any of them wanted to think about, and it wouldn't have been possible without inside information from someone with access to English military plans. William didn't know who had helped him, but he was grateful for the intervention. It suggested that he had friends in unexpected places, that not everyone in the English court was his enemy. Isabella, for her part, had to be extremely careful after sending that warning. She covered her tracks, used loyal servants who could be trusted to keep secrets, and maintained her public persona as a dutiful princess who supported her father-in-law's policies. But privately, she'd crossed a line, had actively helped England's most wanted enemy, and there was no going back from that choice. Over time, William and Isabella managed to communicate occasionally, using intermediaries and coded messages. These communications were risky for both of them, but they developed a connection that transcended the political and military conflict dividing their nations. They wrote to each other about philosophy and ideas, about what freedom meant, and whether it was worth the terrible price being paid for it. Isabella shared her thoughts about being trapped in a loveless political marriage, about watching King Edward's cruelty and being powerless to stop it. William wrote about his losses, about Murron and his father, about the weight of responsibility for all the men who had died following his leadership. Their correspondence became something important to both of them, a space where they could be honest, where they could express doubts and fears without worrying about maintaining the public personas they were forced to project. For William, it was a reminder that not all English people were his enemies, that individual humans were more complex than the nationalities and loyalties that divided them. For Isabella, it was a connection to something meaningful, a cause larger than the petty court intrigues that dominated her daily life. They managed to meet in person one more time, another secret meeting arranged through intermediaries. This time there was no pretense of negotiation or diplomacy. They simply talked as two people who had found an unexpected friendship in impossible circumstances. William told her honestly that he expected to be captured eventually, that his luck couldn't hold forever, and that too many people were hunting him. He said he didn't fear death itself, but he feared what it would mean for Scotland if he died without achieving independence. Isabella listened and then told him something important. She was pregnant, and the child was his, not Prince Edward's. She explained that her husband showed no real interest in her, that their marriage existed only on paper. The brief time she and William had spent together had resulted in a child that would be born into English royalty, but would carry Scottish blood. This revelation stunned William. He'd never imagined having children, not after losing Murron, not while living as a fugitive with death constantly approaching. The idea that part of him would survive, would grow up in England's royal family, was both wonderful and strange. Isabella told him that the child would never know its true father, that she would raise it as Prince Edward's heir to avoid scandal and protect both herself and the baby. But she wanted William to know, wanted him to understand that his legacy would extend beyond military resistance, that something of him would persist even after he was gone. They parted knowing they would probably never see each other again. Isabella returned to the English court, hiding her secret and preparing to play the role of faithful wife and mother. William returned to his fugitive existence, carrying the knowledge that somewhere in England a child of his would be born, a small piece of hope in a world that seemed increasingly hopeless. Robert the Bruce had lived with terrible guilt since Falkirk. He hadn't personally betrayed Wallace. He'd withdrawn his forces to save them from destruction, not because of English bribes, but he knew that his withdrawal had contributed to the catastrophic collapse of the Scottish lines. He'd spent the years since Falkirk trying to justify his actions to himself. He told himself he'd saved his men to fight another day, that throwing away lives in a battle that was already lost would have been foolish. He said he'd been thinking strategically, preserving forces that Scotland would need for future conflicts. But no amount of rationalization could completely erase the guilt. He'd abandoned Wallace and the common soldiers who had no noble patron to withdraw them from danger. He'd put his own political survival above the cause he'd claimed to support. And now Wallace was still fighting, still resisting, while Robert lived in relative safety, waiting for a better opportunity. The guilt became unbearable when Robert learned that his father had indeed been negotiating with England, had been making plans to support English authority in exchange for protection of Bruce family interests. The elder Bruce had been playing both sides, and Robert had been complicit through his silence and inaction. Robert finally confronted his father, challenging the old man's cynical pragmatism. He said that some things mattered more than political advantage, that Scotland's freedom was worth fighting for, even if the odds were terrible, that watching Wallace sacrifice everything while the nobles hedged their bets was shameful. The confrontation ended with Robert making a decision. He would commit fully to Scottish independence, would risk his family's position and his own life to support the cause. He wouldn't wait for safe opportunities or favorable conditions. He would fight, and if he died, at least he'd die with honor, instead of living with the knowledge that he'd been a coward when courage was needed most. He began secretly organizing support for a renewed rebellion, reaching out to clan leaders and other nobles, building a network that could eventually challenge English rule again. He couldn't undo what had happened at Falkirk, couldn't bring back the men who had died there, but he could ensure their sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. Robert also tried to make contact with Wallace, wanting to apologize for his withdrawal from Falkirk and to coordinate future resistance. But Wallace was difficult to reach, constantly moving to avoid capture, and deeply skeptical of nobles after being betrayed so many times. When they finally managed to meet, the conversation was tense. William listened to Robert's apologies and promises, but his face showed the weariness of someone who'd heard similar words before. He asked Robert what was different now, why he should trust Bruce when trust had been proven so dangerous. Robert had no perfect answer. He could only say that he'd learned from his mistakes, that guilt and shame had taught him what honor should have taught him earlier. He offered to serve under Wallace's command, to subordinate his own ambitions to the larger cause, to prove through actions, rather than words, that his commitment was genuine. William accepted this offer cautiously, recognizing that he needed allies, but unable to fully trust someone who had failed him before. It was the beginning of a partnership that would eventually transform Scottish resistance, but that transformation lay in the future, beyond horizons neither man could yet see. As years of fugitive existence took their toll, William's circle of companions grew smaller. The constant danger, the hardship of always moving, the knowledge that anyone close to him was at risk. All of these factors meant that only the most loyal remained. Among those who stayed was a man William had known since childhood, someone from his village who had fought alongside him since the very beginning. This man had shared victories and defeats, had proven himself in countless situations, had earned William's complete trust. But King Edward's agents understood that the only way to capture Wallace was through betrayal by someone close to him. They'd been systematically approaching people in Wallace's circle, offering enormous rewards, making threats against family members, using every form of pressure and inducement they could devise. Eventually they found someone who could be turned. The reasons were complex: exhaustion from years of running, fear for family members who were suffering because of their connection to Wallace, the temptation of gold that could ensure a comfortable life, simple human weakness under relentless pressure. The betrayal was carefully arranged. English forces were told where Wallace would be on a specific night, in a specific location. They assembled a large force, determined that this time there would be no escape, no last-minute warning to save him. William walked into the trap without suspicion. He'd trusted this friend completely, had relied on him for years. When English soldiers surrounded the building where he was sleeping, his first thought was that they'd been unlucky, that somehow the English had stumbled across them by chance. Only when he saw his friend standing with the English commander, accepting a bag of gold, did William understand what had happened. The moment of realization was devastating, not because of the physical danger, but because of what it meant about human nature and the limits of loyalty. He tried to fight his way out, but there were too many soldiers, too many swords and spears. He was wounded, disarmed, and finally overcome. They bound his hands and dragged him outside, where more English soldiers waited to ensure he couldn't escape. As they took him away, William looked one last time at the man who had betrayed him. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The betrayer couldn't meet his eyes, looking down at the gold in his hands, as if wondering whether it was worth the price he'd just paid for it. William was loaded onto a cart, chained and guarded, beginning the long journey to London, where King Edward waited. The years of running were over. There would be no more escapes, no more narrow misses. His time as a free man had ended, and all that remained was to face whatever fate England had prepared for him. The journey to London took several days. William was kept in chains, surrounded by guards who had been given strict orders not to let him escape under any circumstances. English commanders weren't taking any chances. They'd been chasing Wallace for too long to risk losing him now. Along the route, people gathered to watch the prisoner pass. Some were English citizens who came out to see the notorious rebel finally captured, to witness the man who had caused so much trouble for their king. Others were Scots who had heard that Wallace had been taken, who came to see if the rumors were true. The Scottish onlookers were silent and solemn. They watched their hero being transported in chains, and their faces showed grief and anger. Some wept openly. Others simply stared, trying to commit the moment to memory. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders to see the man whose name had become synonymous with Scottish resistance. William remained composed throughout the journey, his face showing neither fear nor despair. He'd known this day would eventually come, had accepted that capture was the likely outcome of his years of resistance. He refused to give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him broken or begging. In Edinburgh, before the final leg of the journey to London, English soldiers paraded him through the streets as a demonstration of English power. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy King Edward. This is the fate of rebels. This is proof that resistance is ultimately futile. Scottish citizens were forced to watch, required to attend the spectacle as a reminder of English authority. But their faces showed defiance rather than acceptance. Many looked at Wallace with pride rather than pity, seeing him as someone who had fought bravely even in defeat. Young men in the crowd memorized the scene, their eyes burning with anger and determination. Wallace's capture wasn't crushing Scottish resistance. It was creating the next generation of rebels, ensuring that his cause would outlive him. When William finally reached London, he was taken to the Tower, the formidable fortress that served as prison for important political prisoners. He was placed in a cell, still chained, and left to contemplate his situation. English officials came to visit him, offering one final chance to save himself. They told him that King Edward might show mercy if Wallace would publicly recant his rebellion, acknowledge English authority over Scotland, and beg forgiveness for his crimes. William refused without hesitation. He told them that he'd never committed any crime except defending his homeland, that acknowledging English authority would betray everything he'd fought for, and that he'd rather die with honor than live as a traitor to Scotland. The officials tried various approaches. Some appealed to his sense of self-preservation, pointing out that execution would be brutal and painful, while cooperation might allow him to live comfortably, perhaps even with certain freedoms. Others tried intimidation, describing in graphic detail the torture and execution methods reserved for traitors, hoping to break his resolve through fear. William listened to all of it without visible emotion. He'd made peace with death years ago, probably on the day Maron died. Everything since then had been borrowed time, a chance to strike back at injustice and to give Scotland hope for freedom. If that time was ending now, at least he'd used it for something that mattered. He told the officials that pain was temporary, but betrayal was permanent. He said that men die, but causes can live forever if someone is willing to stand by them. He explained that accepting English mercy would accomplish what all of King Edward's armies had failed to do. It would prove that Scottish resistance could be broken, that everyone had a price, that freedom wasn't worth the ultimate sacrifice. The officials left frustrated and somewhat unnerved. They'd expected a broken man after years of being hunted, someone exhausted enough to grasp at any chance for survival. Instead, they found someone who seemed almost serene, who had moved beyond fear into a place where threats had no power. King Edward himself came to see Wallace, making a rare visit to the Tower. The old king wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had caused him so much trouble, to try one final time to break him before the execution. Their meeting was brief and tense. Edward offered Wallace his life in exchange for public submission, sweetening the offer with promises of land, titles, and wealth. He told William that all of Scotland's suffering could end if Wallace would simply bend his knee and acknowledge English sovereignty. William looked at the aging king, seeing a man whose entire identity was built on conquest and control. Someone who couldn't comprehend that some people valued freedom more than survival. He told Edward that he'd never been fighting for personal gain, so personal rewards meant nothing to him. Scotland's freedom wasn't his to sell or trade away. Edward, angered by this refusal, told Wallace that his execution would be made as brutal and public as possible, that he would die slowly and painfully as an example to anyone else who might think about rebellion. The king wanted Wallace to understand exactly what his stubbornness would cost him. William's response was simple and direct. He said that Edward could destroy his body, but the idea he represented would survive. Every Scot who witnessed his execution would remember why he died. His death would inspire more resistance, not less. In trying to crush Scottish hope, Edward would actually be preserving it. The king left the cell, knowing that he'd failed to break Wallace's spirit. It was a small but significant defeat for a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through power and intimidation. William was brought to trial in Westminster Hall, a grand building filled with English nobles and officials. The trial was meant to be a formal legal proceeding, but everyone knew it was really just theatre, a public display before the predetermined execution. The charges were read aloud: treason against the king, murder of English soldiers, destruction of royal property, and various other crimes. Each charge was technically accurate in the sense that William had done these things, though the framing ignored the context of occupation and resistance. William was asked how he pleaded to the charge of treason. His answer was clear and unwavering. He could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never sworn loyalty to. Edward was not his king. England had no legitimate authority over Scotland, and defending his homeland against foreign invasion was not treason, but duty. This response caused murmuring throughout the hall. According to English law, all Scots were subjects of the English crown, so resistance to English authority was, by definition, treason. But William was challenging the fundamental premise of that law, arguing that England's claim to Scotland was illegitimate from the start. The judges, handpicked by King Edward, quickly dismissed this defense. They ruled that legal questions about sovereignty were not William's to decide, that English law determined who was and wasn't a traitor, and that his guilt was obvious and undeniable. William was allowed to speak before sentencing, and he used the opportunity to address the assembled nobles and officials. He spoke about Scotland's right to self-governance, about the brutality of English occupation, about the suffering of ordinary people under foreign rule. He reminded them that Scotland had been an independent nation for centuries before England's current aggression. He also spoke about the future, predicting that Scotland would eventually be free, regardless of his personal fate. He said that the desire for freedom was something you couldn't execute, couldn't defeat in battle, couldn't suppress through cruelty. As long as people remembered what freedom meant, they would continue fighting for it. Some in the hall listened with visible discomfort, perhaps recognizing truth in his words, even though they were on opposite sides of the conflict. Others dismissed him as a deluded rebel, spouting the propaganda of a lost cause. But everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant. A man facing certain death who refused to be cowed, who used his last public moments to challenge the very foundations of English authority. The verdict was delivered quickly, guilty on all charges. The sentence was equally swift. William Wallace would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors that involved torture and dismemberment designed to maximize suffering and provide a horrifying public spectacle. William received the sentence without visible reaction. He'd known what to expect. Nothing that had happened in the trial surprised him. He was simply enduring one final indignity before the end, maintaining his dignity, while England tried one last time to break his spirit. The execution was scheduled for a public square in London, where large crowds could witness it. The English authorities wanted maximum attendance, wanted this to be a spectacle that would be discussed and remembered, a warning to anyone who might consider rebellion against English rule. The morning was grey and damp, with crowds gathering hours before the scheduled execution. Thousands of people filled the square, English citizens curious to see the famous rebel executed. Scottish prisoners forced to witness their leader's death, nobles and officials there to represent the Crown's authority. William was brought to the execution site in a cart, still in chains. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some jeered and threw refuse, others watched in silence. A few Scottish voices called out words of support that were quickly silenced by English guards. He was taken to the platform where the execution would take place. The instruments of torture and death were clearly visible. Ropes, knives, a fire for burning, the block where dismemberment would occur. It was designed to be as intimidating as possible, to break prisoners' will at the last moment. The executioner offered William a sedative drink, a bitter mixture that would dull the pain of what was to come. It was a small mercy sometimes offered to condemned prisoners, a way to make the ordeal slightly more bearable. William refused the drink. He wanted to face death with full awareness, wanted no numbing of his senses or clouding of his mind. If he was going to die for Scotland, he would do it completely conscious and present, giving England no satisfaction of seeing him escape through unconsciousness. The execution began with the hanging, though not long enough to kill him, just enough to inflict pain and terror. He was then cut down while still conscious, to face the next stages of the punishment. The crowd watched with varying emotions. Some had come for entertainment, viewing public executions as gruesome spectacle. Others felt uncomfortable, wondering if this level of cruelty was justified even against an enemy. Scottish observers wept or prayed, helpless to intervene, but refusing to look away from their hero's suffering. Through it all, William remained defiant. He didn't scream or beg, didn't give the crowd the show of complete degradation that such executions were designed to produce. His face showed pain. He was human, and the torture was severe, but also a kind of transcendence, as if his mind had moved beyond the physical suffering to something else. The executioner, following his instructions, asked William if he wished to confess his crimes and beg King Edward's mercy. Even now, even at this final moment, England wanted him to submit, to validate their authority by acknowledging his wrongdoing. William gathered his strength for one final statement. Instead of begging for mercy or confessing crimes, instead of giving England the submission they craved, he shouted a single word with all the force remaining in his tortured body. Freedom! The word rang across the square, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't a plea or a question. It was a declaration, a final defiance, a reminder of what he'd fought for and what his death represented. In that moment, he transformed his execution from England's triumph into something else, a martyrdom that would inspire rather than intimidate. The crowd fell silent, stunned by this act of defiance even in the face of death. The executioner, momentarily thrown off his routine, hesitated. English officials looked uncomfortable, realizing that this execution wasn't producing the effect they'd intended. Scottish observers heard that cry and felt something shift inside them. Their leader was dying, yes, but he was dying undefeated in spirit, showing them that freedom was worth any sacrifice. His courage in these final moments was teaching them something more powerful than any military victory could have. The execution continued to its brutal conclusion. William's body was dismembered, the parts to be displayed in different Scottish cities as a warning to potential rebels. His head would be placed on London Bridge, a grim trophy of England's victory. But as his body was being dealt with according to the executioner's terrible instructions, something unexpected was happening throughout the crowd. The Scottish prisoners who had been forced to attend who were meant to be intimidated into submission, instead felt their resolve hardening. They'd watched their leader die with honor, refusing to submit even when submission might have brought mercy. Word of Wallace's execution and his final cry of freedom began spreading immediately. Travelers carried the story north into Scotland, where it moved from village to village, from clan to clan, transforming as it traveled. The story emphasized his courage, his refusal to beg, his final defiant shout. In Scottish homes, parents told children about William Wallace, about how he'd fought for their freedom and had died rather than betray his cause. The story became legend almost immediately, taking on symbolic power that transcended the historical reality. English authorities had hoped that Wallace's brutal execution would end Scottish resistance, would demonstrate the futility of rebellion so clearly that no one would dare follow his example. Instead, they'd created a martyr whose death would inspire generations of Scots to continue fighting for independence. Robert the Bruce, hearing the news of Wallace's execution, felt the full weight of his earlier failures crash down upon him. Wallace had given everything for Scotland, while Robert had hedged and calculated and protected his own interests. Now Wallace was dead, and Robert was alive, and that survival felt like shame rather than good fortune. He made a vow, standing alone in his chambers, that Wallace's sacrifice would not be meaningless. He would take up the cause that Wallace had died for, would unite Scotland and lead it to independence, would ensure that the dream Wallace had fought for would eventually be realized. In the months and years following Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce worked tirelessly to rebuild Scottish resistance. He reached out to clan leaders who had fought with Wallace, to nobles who had previously been divided, to common people who remembered what Wallace had represented. His message was simple but powerful. Wallace had shown them that Scotland could fight for its freedom, could resist English occupation, could refuse to accept foreign rule. Now they needed to finish what Wallace had started, to achieve the independence he'd died for. Robert had learned from the mistakes of the past. He knew that Scottish forces couldn't simply rely on raw courage and hope. They needed coordination, resources, and political legitimacy. He leveraged his noble connections, his claim to the Scottish throne, and his newfound commitment to the cause to build a more sustainable resistance movement. He also understood that he needed to win back the trust of common Scots who remembered his withdrawal from Falkirk. He fought alongside his men in dangerous battles, shared their hardships, and demonstrated through actions rather than words that his commitment was genuine. Gradually, he earned respect and loyalty that couldn't be commanded or inherited. The Scottish clans began uniting under Robert's leadership in ways they hadn't even under Wallace. His noble birth gave him legitimacy that Wallace had lacked, while his genuine commitment to independence prevented the cynical political maneuvering that had plagued earlier efforts. King Edward's death removed one of Scotland's most formidable enemies. The old king died still obsessed with conquering Scotland, still bitter about Wallace's defiance, still determined to crush Scottish independence. But his son, Prince Edward, lacked his father's ruthless determination and military skill. Robert the Bruce formally claimed the Scottish throne, having himself crowned King of Scots in a ceremony that asserted Scotland's independence. It was a bold political move, one that committed him irrevocably to the cause of Scottish freedom. There would be no more hedging, no more keeping options open for reconciliation with England. The English responded with military force, as Robert knew they would. But the new English king's campaigns lacked the strategic brilliance of his father's. English forces won some battles, but couldn't maintain control of Scottish territory, couldn't prevent Robert from rebuilding his army after each defeat, couldn't break the Scottish will to resist. Robert adopted many of the tactics Wallace had pioneered, avoiding set-piece battles where English advantages in armour and cavalry were decisive, using knowledge of terrain to offset numerical inferiority, striking quickly and disappearing before English forces could respond effectively. He also worked to prevent the kind of betrayals that had destroyed Wallace. He built a corps of absolutely loyal commanders, men who shared his vision for Scotland and who couldn't be bribed or intimidated into switching sides. He made it clear that betrayal would be punished severely, that anyone who sold out Scotland would face swift justice. The decisive moment came at Bannockburn in 1314, years after Wallace's death, but directly descended from his legacy of resistance. The English king led a massive army into Scotland, determined to finally crush Robert the Bruce's rebellion and establish permanent English control. The two armies met near Stirling, not far from where Wallace had won his great victory decades earlier. It felt symbolically appropriate, as if Scottish history was coming full circle, returning to the site of its greatest triumph. Robert positioned his forces carefully, using marshy ground and carefully prepared defences to neutralize English advantages. He'd learned from both Wallace's victories and his defeats, understanding what tactics worked against English heavy cavalry and professional soldiers. The battle lasted 2 days of intense fighting. The English army was larger and better equipped, but the Scottish forces fought with a determination born from years of struggle and the memory of William Wallace's sacrifice. They knew this was their moment, their chance to finally achieve what Wallace had died for. Robert commanded brilliantly, making tactical adjustments as the battle developed, inspiring his men through personal example and strategic brilliance. He fought alongside them, risking his life in crucial moments, showing that their king wouldn't ask them to face dangers he wouldn't face himself. When the English cavalry charged, they met the same kind of disciplined resistance that Wallace had pioneered at Stirling. Long spears, coordinated formations, Scottish fighters who refused to break and run. The marshy ground turned English strengths into weaknesses, causing horses to stumble and heavily armoured knights to struggle in the mud. As the battle turned decisively in Scotland's favour, English forces began to retreat, the retreat turning into a rout. Scottish forces pursued, inflicting devastating casualties on the fleeing English army. The English king himself barely escaped capture, abandoning supplies and equipment in his desperate flight. The victory at Bannockburn was complete and overwhelming. Scotland had defeated the largest English army sent against it, had proven beyond doubt that Scottish independence was viable, that the dream Wallace had fought for could become reality. The immediate aftermath of Bannockburn saw Scotland secure in its independence for the first time in decades. Robert the Bruce ruled as King of Scots, respected by his people and increasingly recognized by other European kingdoms as Scotland's legitimate monarch. The English were forced to acknowledge Scottish independence in formal treaties, though it would take years of negotiation and continued military pressure to extract these concessions. But the fundamental victory had been won. Scotland was once again a free and independent nation. Throughout the celebrations and formal ceremonies, Robert the Bruce ensured that William Wallace was remembered and honoured. He spoke publicly about how Wallace had kept the dream of Scottish freedom alive through the darkest times, how his sacrifice had inspired the resistance that eventually achieved victory. Monuments were erected to Wallace's memory. Songs and stories about him proliferated, ensuring that future generations would know about the farmer who had become a hero, the common man who had stood up to kings and refused to surrender, even in the face of death. Robert recognized that his own success had been built on Wallace's foundation. Without Wallace's early victories, showing that England could be beaten, without his years of resistance keeping hope alive, without his martyrdom inspiring Scots to continue fighting, Bannockburn might never have been possible. In Scottish villages throughout the land, people told children about William Wallace and his cry of freedom, even as he died. The story became part of Scottish national identity, a reminder of what their ancestors had sacrificed to win independence, a teaching tool about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the cost is terrible. Wallace never lived to see Scotland free. He died years before Bannockburn, never knowing that his sacrifice would eventually lead to the independence he'd fought for. But his influence had shaped events beyond his own lifetime, had set forces in motion that couldn't be stopped even by his death. In his final moments, William had shouted freedom, not because he believed he would personally experience it, but because he believed the cause was worth dying for. That selflessness, that willingness to sacrifice everything for a principle larger than himself, had transformed him from a man into a symbol that no execution could destroy. The English had killed William Wallace's body, but they'd failed completely to kill what he represented. His courage in the face of death, his refusal to submit, his unwavering commitment to Scottish freedom, these had become immortal, woven into Scottish culture and identity in ways that would persist for centuries. Robert the Bruce, now secure as King of Scots, sometimes reflected on the different paths he and Wallace had taken. Wallace had been pure in his commitment from the beginning, while Robert had wavered and calculated and sometimes failed. But both men, in their different ways, had contributed to Scotland's freedom. Perhaps that was the real lesson, that achieving great things required both idealistic courage and practical leadership, both the willingness to die for principles and the wisdom to build institutions that would preserve those principles. Wallace had provided the inspiration. Robert had provided the political skill and persistence to translate that inspiration into lasting reality. As Robert grew old, he made sure that Wallace's story would be preserved accurately, that future generations would understand what this common farmer had accomplished and what he'd sacrificed. He commissioned histories, supported poets and songwriters, and spoke frequently about how Scotland's freedom had been won through the courage of ordinary people, not just the calculations of nobles and kings. The story of William Wallace spread beyond Scotland's borders, becoming known throughout Europe as an example of successful resistance against tyranny. Other peoples facing oppression heard about the Scottish farmer who had defied an empire and refused to surrender even when tortured to death. His example inspired resistance movements in other lands, other times, showing that courage and commitment could sometimes overcome superior force. In quiet moments, Robert would sometimes think about that final cry, freedom, and wonder what it had cost Wallace to maintain his defiance, even in such extreme circumstances. It must have taken every bit of strength and will the man possessed, must have required moving beyond normal human limits of endurance. But Wallace had done it, had refused to be broken, had died free in spirit even while his body was being destroyed. That spiritual freedom, that inner defiance that no torture could touch, had proven more powerful than all of England's military might. Scotland was free now, its independence secured through battles and treaties. But the freedom that mattered most the freedom of the human spirit, the refusal to accept oppression, the willingness to stand up for what's right, regardless of consequences. That freedom had been won the moment William Wallace shouted his final defiant word from the executioner's platform. His body had been cut into pieces and displayed across Scotland as a warning. But those displays had produced the opposite effect. They'd reminded every Scot of what their countrymen had sacrificed, had transformed Wallace from a military leader into an eternal symbol of Scottish courage and determination. And so the story ended, not with despair, but with hope, not with defeat, but with triumph. William Wallace had died, but Scotland lived. The man had been killed, but the cause survived. The physical body had been destroyed, but the spirit, the thing that had shouted freedom, even in the face of death, that spirit was immortal. In villages across Scotland, in the Highlands and Lowlands, in castles and cottages, people would continue telling his story for generations to come. They would remember the love he'd lost, the battles he'd fought, the betrayals he'd endured, and the courage he'd shown even at the very end. And they would remember that sometimes the things worth having are the things worth dying for, that freedom is never given freely, but must be won through sacrifice, and that one person with courage can inspire a nation to achieve the seemingly impossible. The story of William Wallace was many things, a tale of love and loss, of war and betrayal, of courage and sacrifice. But most of all, it was a story about freedom, about what it means to fight for something larger than yourself, and about how the human spirit, once committed to a cause, cannot truly be conquered, no matter what happens to the body. And with that understanding, with Wallace's memory secured and his cause achieved, Scotland moved forward into its future as a free nation, carrying the legacy of the man who had given everything so that his people might live without chains. The Highlands remained green and beautiful. The lochs reflected the changing sky, and children played freely in villages that now belonged to Scotland alone. The land their ancestors had fought for was theirs again, held by Scottish hands, governed by Scottish laws, home to a free people. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the hills, people swore they could hear an echo from the past, a single word carried on the breeze, a reminder of what had been won and what had been sacrificed to win it. Freedom. The word seemed to hang in the air, a promise and a memory all at once. Years turned into decades, and the Scotland that Wallace had fought for continued to grow and change. The battles were over now, the wars had ended, but the peace that followed was the peace he had dreamed of, a Scotland that belonged to its own people, where children could grow up without fear of foreign soldiers, where farmers could work their land without English tax collectors taking what they'd earned. In the village where William had grown up, where he'd loved Murren and buried his father, life went on in the gentle rhythms he'd once known. New generations were born who had never experienced English occupation, who knew Wallace only as a story their grandparents told, a legend from a time that seemed almost mythical in its distance. But the older people remembered. They remembered the fear and the anger, the daily humiliations and the grinding oppression. They remembered when hoping for freedom seemed foolish, when resistance seemed impossible, and they remembered the man who had refused to accept that impossibility, who had shown them through his actions that courage could make a difference. The cottage where William and Murren had planned their secret life together still stood, though other families lived there now. Sometimes travellers would stop and ask if this was truly Wallace's home, and the current residents would nod and point out small details: the stone where William had sat and sharpened his sword, the path where Murren had walked when she came to visit, the hilltop where you could see the whole valley spread out below. These places had become sacred in a way, not because of any religious significance, but because they connected the present to that crucial moment in Scottish history when everything had changed. Standing in those spaces, you could almost feel the presence of the people who had lived and loved and fought there, could almost hear echoes of conversations and laughter from decades past. The thistle that Murren had given William before he left as a child had become a symbol of Scotland itself, the purple flower that grew wild across the hills, representing the resilience and beauty of the Scottish people. When Robert the Bruce designed the symbols of Scottish independence, he made sure the thistle was prominently featured, a deliberate nod to Wallace's memory and to the girl who had loved him. In England, Princess Isabella had raised her child as promised, never revealing the truth about the baby's father. The child grew up as a prince of England, educated and privileged, trained for leadership and responsibility. But Isabella, in private moments, would tell him stories about courage and principle, about fighting for what's right even when the cost is high, about a man she'd once known who had valued freedom above his own life. She never said that man was the child's true father. That secret was too dangerous to share. But she made sure her son understood that nobility came from actions rather than birth, that true greatness meant serving something larger than yourself, that the measure of a person was found in their willingness to stand up for their beliefs. As Isabella grew older, she would sometimes sit by a window, looking north towards Scotland, remembering her brief meetings with William, their letters and conversations, the connection they'd shared across the divide of war and politics. She'd made her choices, had played her part in history's great events, and though her role was hidden and would never be publicly known, she found satisfaction in knowing she'd helped in small ways. When she died, years after William, she was buried with honors appropriate to her royal status. But among her personal possessions, carefully preserved, was a small cloth, a piece of Scottish plaid that William had once given her during one of their secret meetings. It was simple and worn, worth nothing to anyone else, but to her it represented something precious and true, in a life that had been dominated by political necessity and formal obligation. Robert the Bruce ruled Scotland for many years, proving to be a capable and generally just king. He never forgot the lessons he'd learned from his failures at Falkirk, never forgot that leadership meant serving the people rather than simply commanding them. When difficult decisions arose, he would sometimes ask himself what Wallace would have done, using the memory of the man who had been both his rival and his inspiration as a moral compass. Before Robert died, he made arrangements for his own memorial, but he also ensured that memorials to Wallace would be maintained and honored. He understood that his own accomplishments had been built on Wallace's foundation, that Scotland's freedom had been won by many hands and hearts, not just by kings and nobles, but by common people who had been willing to sacrifice everything. The battles at Stirling and Bannockburn became part of Scottish military tradition, studied by commanders and remembered by soldiers. The tactics Wallace had developed, using terrain, coordinating infantry against cavalry, turning apparent weaknesses into strengths, influenced Scottish military thinking for generations. But more than the military innovations, it was Wallace's spirit that endured. The idea that ordinary people could make history, that standing up to power was possible, that freedom was worth fighting for regardless of the odds. These concepts became woven into Scottish identity so deeply that they would persist even through later centuries of struggle and change. In the Highlands, where clans maintained their traditional ways, Wallace's story was told around fires, passed from generation to generation in Gaelic, the ancient language of Scotland. The storytellers would embellish and elaborate, adding details that may or may not have been historically accurate, but the core of the story remained true. A man had stood up for his people, had refused to submit, had given everything for freedom. The children who listened to these stories with wide eyes would grow up carrying Wallace's example with them. Some would become leaders themselves, drawing on his courage when facing their own challenges. People free, its future in Scottish hands. And if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the ancient hills, you might still hear that echo from centuries past, a single word that summed up everything Wallace had lived and died for, everything Scotland had achieved, everything that made their long struggle worthwhile. Freedom. The word faded into silence, into the peaceful Scottish night, into the dreams of children who would carry the story forward into another generation. The tale of William Wallace was told, from his childhood loss to his adult courage, from his first rebellion to his final defiance, from his death to the victory that followed. And now, with the story complete, with Scotland free and peaceful, with Wallace's memory secure and his sacrifice honoured, we can let the tale rest. We can close our eyes and drift into sleep, secure in the knowledge that heroes existed, that freedom was possible, that one person's courage could change the world, forever grateful to the man who loved it more than life itself. Good night. If you are still awake, try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks,